Massive welcome to Bob tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. All the way from sunny near Kettering in a small village. I won't mention it just in case. But no, thanks so much, Bob. Really looking forward to this. We've got some really keen macro photographers in our club, so I'm sure they're going to hang on to every word. We will make the interval brief at 9 o'clock and or around 9 o'clock, a natural break. What I didn't ask is, what about questions? How would you like to field them, Bob?
I'm happy to take questions as we go, but what I will say is that too many will extend the talk. I mean, it's up to you, really.
Okay.
But I'm quite happy to take them as you go, or alternatively keep them until the. I mean, when people are going and having their 5-minute comfort break, that's a good time for questions. And then again, you know, at the end,
okay,
however long you want to go, I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Let's do that then, and then we won't interrupt your flow. So,
but okay, if something isn't making, sorry, apologies for butting in, Diane. If something isn't making sense, when one's doing these sort of presentations in front of an audience, of course, you can soon get an idea if something's not making sense. You see furrowed brows. If something is not making sense, please do interrupt. Because you know, my whole point this evening is to try and demystify some of the macro stuff. And if I've failed to do that, then really you've got me here in vain, really.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'll keep an eye on the chat, and if there is anything, then that will be the case. So that's what it's looking like for this evening. We'll try and close for 10 o'clock. I do, please excuse me, I think I've got one of those frogs in my throat from earlier. They were leaping around quite a lot, so I'll try and clear that in a minute. So yeah, so if we finish by around 10 o'clock, Bob, if that's okay with you.
No problem, yeah.
That would be fantastic. Matthew, before we go on to what's happening, I've got a couple of quick notices. First of all, can I say a massive congratulations to Alan Godfrey for the brilliant upside down image, which was awarded Photo of the Month. I thought it was absolutely brilliant, loved it. And after Matthew saying it made him think, I looked at it a bit more closely as well, and I thought it was superb. So well done on that one, Alan. Oh, we got it there. Fantastic.
Yeah, on the left there, yeah.
Yeah, nice one. Really enjoyed that. Reminder also that if you've got any suggestions or proposals for how the club is run, email our secretary, Bill Edwards, on secretary@stortfordcamera.club, because obviously we've got our AGM coming up soon. So it's your club. Any suggestions, please do put them forward. Also, your suggestions for next year's photo task, and that will also go to Bill Edwards. And the third thing regarding Bill, you've been a busy boy this week. Thanks, Bill, for forming a special interest group, which is the large format photography. Let Bill know if you're interested. I know we have got a few members who loved his presentation the other week and who are very interested in the large format photography. So please do let him know. And it's not too late to put forward any suggestions and offers for May and June's Zoom sessions. Obviously, we can't get together as a whole group on the summer programme yet. We are hoping for that for the beginning of July. So we are putting together, or should I say Sophia is putting together an amazing programme for May and June. But do let her know if there's anything in particular you want, or if you'd like to run a workshop, or you might want to talk about your travel photos, anything at all, let Sophia know. program@stortfordcamera.club. So again, email her at program@stortfordcamera.club. Can we have a quick look, Matthew, at what's coming up?
Okay.
So multi-battle next week, and we have got a guest club from Paisley in Scotland, which will be brilliant. I think there's 6 clubs altogether in the multi-battle, judged by Chris Palmer. It's a knockout the following week, so dig out your favourite 2 photos. It's a fun night. It is literally, it's a knockout. 2 get put up on the screen, 1 gets knocked out. It's members vote. And try and put up stuff that nobody's seen before, so we can't put names to the images, and surprises are always good. Chairman's evening, as I've mentioned before, is an oops evening. So those photos that didn't quite work out how you imagined they would be. Here's some examples of, of another type of oops, where it might be you've captured oops photos. So it can either be your own oops errors or oops
I like that one.
captured. Now you get the same, or you get marked also for your title or caption for that. So think about what you're going to call it, what you're going to title it as well. So that's on the 20th of April. I love those images, Matthew. Well done for putting that together. I love the kilt one. Okay, and and I think that's it. I think we'll stop there, because without any further ado, time is cracking on. So Bob, I'd like to hand over to you. If everyone could mute themselves, that would be wonderful. Any questions, put in the chat. And if they're pertinent for that moment, I will jump in, but otherwise we'll leave it to the break. Okay, Bob, over to you.
Bob's muted himself, I think.
Good move, isn't it? Yes. Can you all see me?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so that's good. Look, just a very brief introduction to me, because I've not been to the club before, but then I'll get straight on with what I'm doing. I mean, I'm a wildlife photographer, so this evening, although the techniques I'm going to talk, I've got your frog, I think. The techniques, Diana, the techniques I'm going to talk about this evening are obviously about macro photography. That's what I'm going to do. But the examples I'm going to use are from the wildlife world, although the techniques I talk about are equally as valid, you know, whatever genre of photography you're interested in. Oh, it went pink then. All right. And so whatever genre of photography you're interested in, that'll be covered. So I've been a lifelong wildlife photographer, had the great good fortune in my life to have worked alongside some superb photographers and some superb naturalists. I've been a naturalist since I know not when, but during I did a real job at one point. I'm retired now, as you can probably tell from the grey stuff on top. But I spent my working life as a educationalist, teacher, head teacher, deputy director of education, and education consultant. So education is in my blood. So what I do now is I really try to teach people other aspects of photography and share the lessons that I've been so lucky to learn from other people. That's a very brief introduction, if you like. Let me just get on with what we're going to do this evening then. So hopefully you can now see a shared screen. Yes. Brilliant. Okay. Bear with me a second. Fantastic. So apologies while I get myself organized. Right. Okay. So what I'm going to do this evening, I'm intrigued that a lot of you are keen macro photographers, because it's a genre we're hearing more and more about, but there are not that many people who are into macro photography, largely, I think, because people were or are still scared that it costs a lot of money and is very complicated. What I want to try and do this evening, so apologies if some of the early stuff I say is a bit below some of your skill levels, but what I want to try and do this evening is to try and convince you that you don't actually need to break the bank to actually be a macro photographer. All right, so I want to talk to you about other ways of doing things, if that helps. And then we're going to look at other things at the end. So the latest thing I think in photography world is focus stacking. Some of you may know what that is. I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end. Not going to go into a massive detail because I don't want to bug the whole evening with that this evening. I do one-to-one sessions on that for individuals, but at least cover that at the end. I think focus stacking to me is the latest HDR. I think we can all remember when HDR was the buzzword in photography, and everybody was looking at it. And I think nowadays the latest HDR is focus stacking. It's a great pity it's been around since about the 1830s, I think. And the first time I dealt with it was about 1978. But I did my F panel in macro, by the way, so that's kind of my background really there. Okay, so I've given an introduction to myself. I've said what we're going to do, and I've also said that if you have any questions during this evening, then please do, feel free to ask them. But too many questions will only extend the evening, and I hope that's not going to cause too much problems. So we're here this evening to talk about macro and close-up photography. I just thought I'd state that in case some of you are under the misapprehension, and I don't think we are, because we're very professionally introduced this evening, misapprehension that we're here to talk about the Himalayas or anything. I'm not going to show you vast numbers of photographs of the macro world, simply because I want to talk to you about techniques, but I will show you photographs to try and illustrate techniques. And as I've said, they all come from the natural world. But really, if you want to sum it up, what I feel I'm doing is getting up close and personal. So, this is getting really up close and personal, in this case, to a shield bug. And we can play lots of games in the macro world about putting the different subjects in and out of focus. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So in this instance, this was not a stacked photograph, because you can see that one of the antennae of the shield bug is out of focus, as indeed is the eye looking at it. But that was my plan. I mean, I'm not sure that I'm a great fan of these pictures we now see, where everything is absolutely crystal clear from background, 5 miles away to foreground 1 millimeter away. I mean, I just think that somehow there's something not real about that. And if we're building an image, we want to build something that makes a bit more sense. So for me, as I say, we're in the natural world. We're looking at things that we wouldn't perhaps ordinarily see. So for me as a naturalist, we're looking at, this is a bee, a bumblebee, or a honeybee, really, visiting a geranium flower. But the interesting thing, as far as I'm concerned, is, look at her wings, they're tattered, and she's got mites on her back. So this is a bee that's very near the end of her life cycle, if you like, because she's worn out visiting so many flowers. So for me, what got me into macro photography in effect was seeing things that we wouldn't ordinarily see. Okay, so what do I want to do this evening? Well, just so you get some idea of what we're going to cover. By the way, I'm going to send a copy of everything that I'm presenting this evening onto Sophia, I think, to distribute to people. And I understand also it's being recorded. So hopefully you could backtrack through some of this if you want. But I want to share the fascination I have with macro and close-up photography and try and distinguish what they are, because I think we sometimes get confused between the two. I want to look at some of the pitfalls and techniques. I said to you, I did my F panel on lichens back in 1978. So I've been doing it for a little while. So hopefully I've learned a little bit along the way. And I want to look at some techniques and how they work. And I want to do some, now if I were there in person, I'll be doing some demonstrations. I'm going to try and do them virtually. So those who were logged on early saw me playing around with the fact I've got 2 cameras here, and hopefully we can make some of that happen. And of course, you are a camera club. So we want to share some images. And just for Diane's sake, I just want to state that there are going to be some photographs this evening of 8-legged beasties, and I'm going to give a little warning before they come up. I think I said, for those who were logged on earlier, that I gave this talk once to an RPS group, and people were very concerned, and a lady screamed around the room. So I feel it's sensible to advise nowadays. I'm going to talk a number of times and say that I'm going to provide material afterwards. I'm going to provide Sophia, I think, or Diane, I'm not sure who, but we can have that conversation at the end, with all the information that I presented this evening, as well as all sorts of other links and tips. I'm going to skate over some areas simply because we haven't got 4 hours. So I'm going to give you links to some of those areas where you can go and look on my website and find material on them, plus some other material just for you. And what I always do when I'm giving talks to camera clubs is, you've been kind enough to invite me, so I like to offer some sort of thank you. And so if you mention Bishop Stortford, if you ever book on one of my workshops in the next month or so, then I'll add 5%, take 5% off rather. Anyway, enough of all of that. Let's get down to what drives me. I've already hinted, really, that to me as a naturalist, I was interested in photographing things that we wouldn't see. And I did some work with a lady called Heather Angel back in the New Forest in the early 70s, looking at photographing close-ups of fungi particularly. And she wrote a book at the time, and the 2 opening paragraphs of the book were these: nature has an unlimited capacity to intrigue and delight, worlds of a seashell. This one, hairs of a stinging nettle. I'm going to show you some hairs of a stinging nettle photographs this evening, because it's something that I was intent on doing, and it's taken me many years to do it. But look, it was this piece here. I hope you can see my red dot. Taking macro photographs is a means not just of recording details, but conveying this beauty and fascination to other people by opening their eyes to details that would otherwise pass unnoticed. So as a naturalist, that's what I'm interested in. I'm not particularly interested in snails, but, you know, it's looking at this sort of horrible slimy thing that eats your lettuces in perhaps a different way, you know, and getting right down low and looking at it. By a real tip, if you're trying to do this, don't do it just after you've mown the lawn, because you can see I used a fly mow. So there's lots of very tatty blades of grass here. But, you know, just a word of warning, when you get into the macro world, you see things that you wish you'd noticed beforehand. Okay, so from my point of view, Bob Research, this approach and the work I did with Heather, coupled with my wish to explore the limits of the natural world, is why I get into close-up photography and why it's been a fascination to me. But I've said earlier that, you know, you can use the techniques to photograph anything. For any of you who are looking for a business opportunity, a great friend of mine who lives in Liverpool runs a service. He's retired. He was a deputy to me at one point when I was a headmaster, and he photographs people's jewelry for them and stores it in a secure way on a secure site, so that if it should be stolen, you know, they can provide accurate photographs to an insurance company, so they can actually see, you know, what it was, unfortunately, to recover it. All right, so there's an idea, but the techniques that Stan uses are exactly the same as the techniques I will use, but he doesn't photograph dandelions. This is one of the very first macro photographs I took, so it was taken on slides. I was around in the film days, I'm afraid. And for those who are looking at focus stacking later, I have done focus stacking with film, which is an interesting idea. But there we are. This was somebody asked me to take some photographs for them of dandelions and the seed patterns, and that was what they wanted me to do. And I spent a very long time looking around some fields near Southampton, where I was at university at the time, looking for a dandelion that looked just like that. And when I failed to find it, and the person who'd asked me to do it came out and said to me, "Have you not managed yet?" and laughed when I said, "Well, not quite yet. Just got hold of a dandelion and plucked some seeds out in the right light, and I got the photograph." So there are times in the macro world where you need to cheat a little bit if you get the photograph. Done a lot of work with dragonflies and damselflies. We're going to talk a little bit about that this evening, because I think they're a challenge for people to photograph. But coming back to where I started, I used to be the chairman of a camera club in Towcester, which is South Northamptonshire, and we used to do workshops where we went out into the local woods to do various things, and I ran a macro workshop photographing bluebells. And at the end of the workshop, we went to the local pub and we all looked at our photographs. And this particular photograph, when we looked at it on the screen in the pub, we noticed an interloper, a little character that had joined the photograph, really. And you can see why we didn't see it in the field. We all know how big a bluebell is, but this guy was, you know, very, very tiny indeed. Hello, it's a plant bug. I'm told by somebody it's called Platyarthurus hoffmannsegii, but I'm any experts out there, I'm not an entomologist, so I really can't say. But the point is, it comes back to what I said, it's seeing things that would otherwise pass unnoticed. Okay, so let's get into what is macro photography. You've already said there's a lot of very, very keen people out there, but I'm always keen to say that I think macro is a very abused phrase, because it's used commercially for anything that can refocus remotely close. And I've seen lots of people who've gone out and bought supposedly macro lenses or macro editions and have come along on workshops. So I run a workshop looking at photographing carnivorous plants. I'll show you some examples later this evening. Very, very close up, and they've come across very upset because their macro lens they've spent a lot of money on doesn't work that close. So we need to be really clear. I started off by saying, to me, the whole process is getting up close and personal for me with the natural world. So some sort of definitions I like to live with are these, you know, anything that's more than 3 feet away from you, we're going to call general photography. And we're not going to cover that this evening. I do a lot of that, of course, but sounds like Diane was having frogs that were closer than 3 feet this evening. But anything between 3 feet and 6 inches, let's call close up. And anything that's closer than 6 inches and doesn't require a microscope. I've done some microscopy photography as well. That's how I got into stacking in the first instance, actually. But I'm not going to cover that this evening because that's another area altogether. Let's call that macro photography. Or if you're young, you know, you can think of it in centimeters. I tend to think of feet and inches, I'm afraid. But there we go. Some will tell you that, and more the case, that it's better off as a magnification ratio, because at the end of the day, when you're doing close-up or macro work, what you're trying to do is show up a close-up image of the subject you're trying to photograph. And therefore a better definition really is the amount of magnification ratio. But this is problematic. And it's problematic because we have lots of different cameras nowadays. This is a camera used to put film in, for those of you who remember film cameras. And we had a shutter, and the shutter on the camera was 36 millimeters wide for 35 millimeter film. This is the bit that was 35. And it all came down to Leica and some of the very first 35 millimeter cameras. If you have a quiz evening, it's a good quiz question. Why are 35 millimeter cameras called such? But look, for the standard 35 millimeter or full frame camera, if you like, the shutter or the opening is 36 by 24 millimeters, or the sensor in a full frame camera. For DSLRs, some of the earlier DSLRs, and the Canon 90D is quite a modern camera. I'm not going to talk about particular cameras this evening being good or bad, because I'm not here to sell cameras. But I'll mention various models. The Canon 90D is 22 by 15, and then if you start shooting on Olympus or one of the Micro Four Thirds cameras, I know Olympus do other cameras now, but some of the Micro Four Thirds cameras, Panasonic and so on, and then your sensor is even smaller. All right, and this kind of breaks the problem. It gives us a problem, if you like, with this sort of ratio business, because the ratio of 1:1 is what's talked about as being what makes a photograph macro or not. So if I had a 35 millimeter or full frame camera, an object that was 36 millimeters long is going to touch side to side on the viewfinder. And similarly, if I had a 70D or a 90D or whatever, then it's going to be 22 millimeters wide is going to fill the frame. Okay, so those are the two numbers important. And if we look at a picture, this is the insides of a watch, of course, on a 35 millimeter full frame DSLR. In effect, it was taken on a full frame camera. 35 or 36 millimeters is going to fill the frame. Can you see? But if I change that to my crop sensor camera, 22 millimeters is going to fill the frame. So in effect, if we put those two side by side, you can see there is a value. There is a value in macro photography in using crop sensor cameras. There are downsides as well, and we're going to talk about that a little bit, but there is a value in the sense that you immediately achieve a magnification ratio of an extra 1.5 times, or 1.6, depending on what your camera is, or even twice, if you're using a Micro Four Thirds camera, of course. All right, so there are some benefits, and I hear people saying, well, I must do everything on a full frame camera. I do. I shoot on a full frame camera most of the time, but I do use crop sensor cameras as well for various things. And the 90D is, in fact, a particularly good camera. We'll talk about that perhaps a bit later. But there are some additional benefits, of this, and some additional downsides as well. So this is quite complicated, but if you just hang on to the idea for a moment, when I'm doing this as a talk in front of you, I sort of hold up a camera at this point. But if you imagine a camera with a lens attached to it, and the lens that's attached to the camera has no way of knowing what camera it is, whether it's a crop sensor. Let's think of a Canon or Nikon camera for a moment. That's, so you could put a crop sensor body or a full frame body on the back end of that lens. Okay, if you put a crop sensor on, you're going to get a 1.5 times magnification, but the lens is going to perform exactly the same way. It's the sensor that's giving you the magnification. Thus, for a given magnification, so if you were to imagine that you had a full frame camera, the depth of field, I'm guessing you all know what depth of field. I can't ask you to put your hands up because I can't see you, but you've got some idea. And again, if these things don't make sense, please ask. But the depth of field is going to be whatever it is. If I were to shoot at 1.5 times magnification on that same camera, the depth of field would become less, considerably less. But if I shot with a crop sensor camera on the back of the same lens, I'm going to get that 1.5 times magnification, but for the same depth of field. Does that make a bit of sense to you? In other words, one of the struggles we have in the macro world is depth of field. I'm going to show you a lens a bit later on where the depth of field is 1/5 of 1 millimeter, 1/5 of 1 millimeter. And so very, very small. And so anything you can do to improve on that, is a gain. And in a similar vein, you're going to get better lighting. So really, there is a value in using cropped sensor cameras. We talked briefly about the idea of stacking and bracketing and so on. If you've got a crop sensor camera, you can achieve better things. It's not just down to the fact that Olympus and Panasonic are the only cameras that offer it at the moment. The reason they do is because it's a crop sensor, they're processing less data, and because they're processing less data, they can do it. The time will come when other cameras do some of the same things. So there are benefits, if you will, from crop sensor cameras. Okay, so macro then is getting very close, is getting beyond 1:1. This was taken on quite an old camera nowadays, a Canon 50D with a very specialist lens I'm going to show you a bit later in this evening, and a ring light. We'll talk about lighting as well. And so this is about 1.2 times life size. You know that we don't have ladybirds that big, by the way, up here in Brigstock. But you get the idea. If you were to take a color slide of that ladybird and put it on top of the ladybird, the color slides image would be 1.2 times as big as the ladybird. All right, if you hadn't cropped the image, etc. This is the image as it was taken, but many years ago now. Okay, so what is required? We've talked about the whole notion of getting into macro, and I've tried to say that I want to try and demystify some of the complexity this evening. So what's required? Well, some of you might not be very happy about this. Again, if I do this in person, I always ask for a show of hands, those who hated physics at school, and that's the point I admit to being a physics teacher. So please don't get worried. I'm going to talk a little bit about how lenses work, but in a way that hopefully makes some sort of sense. And I always say at the end of this thing, if I'm doing it in person, that hopefully you'll begin to understand the physics a little bit more. So look, a camera, you've got a lens, you've got a film or a digital sensor, it doesn't really matter which, and you've got an object. This is a landscape. It's a long way away, okay? So the rays of light from the landscape hit the lens, are focused by the lens, and produce an image which is upside down. Let's not worry about why that happens, but it is on the film with a digital sensor. That's the end of the physics lesson. But as long as you're seeing what's going on, but the really important thing is those rays of light, because they're coming from a long way away, are near enough parallel. Okay, if we were to change to something a bit closer, so a still life really, and we were to look at the rays of light, the orange or pinky orange rays of light on your screen are the rays that would have been if it were a landscape. And let's look at the rays of light from this one. Now, clearly, the rays of light are diverging slightly because the object is closer, so that's not a mystery. The lens bends them by the same amount as it did before. So, I guess you can probably see me in your image, but it's bending them by whatever it bent them by before. And obviously, if they're coming in at a sharper angle, they're going out at a sharper angle, and therefore they end up in focus, or indeed not in focus, because they end up focused behind the screen. So what we have to do is we have to alter the lens to make it bend the light more so that the image comes in focus on the screen. And that's all there is really to taking photographs. A bit more to it than that, but in effect, that's what you're doing. So let's get on a little bit closer now. Let's swap our still life for a ladybird, albeit a idealized ladybird. Let's make us much closer. Now the rays of light are going to diverge even more, of course. They hit the lens, they bend same amount, and of course we're back in this world where the lens isn't able to bend them enough. And that really is the problem, you see. The lens cannot be focused any further. We cannot make that lens bend the light anymore. And that's our dilemma. That's our dilemma. And that's what we've got to solve if we want to crack macro photography. It's as simple as that. Really, if you want to crack it, we've got to solve the fact that the camera lens won't bend the light enough to get the image in focus on the film. And so basically, for those who like me have to wear reading glasses, the camera is long-sighted. It can't see that which is too close. All right. And the solutions that we're going to adopt as a macro photographer are ostensibly the same as they do when we admit that we can't see things. These solutions are ostensibly the same as they are for me. When I admit, that I can't read or whatever things, then I'm told, Anne always says, go and get your spectacles, because in fact, I've got lots of them. I actually bought a job lot on eBay because I kept losing them. So and we do that, don't we? When we want to read books, or I do anyway, when I want to read books, because I can't see that which is too close. The other solution is that which is adopted by my late mother-in-law, who used to suggest that the Telegraph was printing smaller than it ever had done, and the sun was a good deal dimmer than it ever had been, because she'd heard all this stuff on global warming, and therefore she couldn't read it unless she sat by the French windows and held the newspaper a long way away. She needed longer arms. We all know that, don't we? I always say it's not that my eye is bad, it's my arms aren't long enough. And the third solution, and I used to say this with a bit of a jest until I gave a talk to a group of opticians who were photographers in Oxford, and they said, well, you know, actually what, Bob, we are actually doing that. We're beginning to be able to improve the eye, and the time will come, they reckoned, around 2030. So, you know, we haven't got too long to wait now, perhaps, where we can tune our own eyes. It's a horrible sort of thought, but we can tune our own eyes to increase our focusing range, or get a range of, and they joked and said, interchangeable eyes. We could have a normal eye for everyday use. We could have a close-up eye for our reading, and then we could have a specialist macro eye for threading needles, something I certainly can't seem to accommodate these days. Or in photographic terms, of course, we could think of those not as interchangeable eyes, but interchangeable lenses. And that's kind of the direction people go down when they first look at macro photography. They're thinking really about specialist lenses, and they'll go out and spend a vast amount of money on some of these lenses. And I'm going to try and convince you, certainly up to the break, that you don't actually need to do that in quite that way. So what I said earlier was that the summary, or the solutions rather, are similar to those that we would use when we admitted that we can't read, you know, a book if it's too small print or the light's bad or whatever. And the first of those, of course, is that we would go and get some spectacles. And the analogous thing to that for your SLR or DSLR or mirrorless or whatever camera is screw in or close-up lenses, and we'll have a little bit of a look at those. I'm not a great fan of them, and you'll see why, but there we are. The other solution is my mother-in-law's solution of longer arms, and for those, we can talk about using extension tubes or bellows, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time looking at that. And then we can look at our specialist interchangeable eyes, if you like, and those are our so-called macro or more specialist lenses. And I will look at that because that's an important area, but I'm going to try and concentrate on the other ones first, if that makes sense. So so let's go through them one by one, really. This idea of spectacles. So this is you know, the idea we're putting a piece of glass in front of our eye that is going to cause the light to bend before it reaches our well, our retina, in effect, which is the film, but actually before it reaches the lens of our eye, which then focuses it on our retina. So look, let's go back to our problem photograph. We've got this ladybird, which is too close to the lens. The lens can't be focused anymore. So the first suggestion or solution that we use is we put a pair of spectacles on the camera, or in effect, we put these close-up lenses. Again, you know, I can't see you all, so I can't really ask for a show of hands, but, you know, I would ordinarily say, have you all heard of these things? And most people have, because they're sort of screw-in lenses that are screwed into the filter thread, much as we'd screw in filters, if you like, to a lens. But they have a different effect, you see, because they bend the light. So the light from the ladybird hits the gray lens, which is the close-up lens, is bent a little bit. So that it's coming out of there at a different angle. So when it hits the blue lens, the camera lens knows what to do about it. You see, as far as the camera lens is concerned, these are the yellow rays of light that came from a distant landscape. So we've really hoodwinked the camera lens into thinking that it's looking at a landscape. It doesn't realize that it's actually looking at something that's a bit closer, because all it's concerned with is the rays of light. And in effect, you know, these red rays of light from the from the ladybird can be then focused, of course, on the film, just as the landscape would have done. I'm hoping that makes a bit of sense. All right. And in a way, here is one of the first problems that you've got with close-up lenses, because in effect, you see, as far as the blue lens from the camera is concerned, these lines here are parallel. And the camera lens has been carefully manufactured and set up and made by the manufacturer. That's why they like to charge you lots of money for them, such that it gives you a very good image of something that is, and the definition, and I apologize for all those who've read on eBay that lenses all have different this, that, and the other. The definition that's used by camera manufacturers ever since, well, certainly back into the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 30s, that is that it works best at 30 times, 30 times its focal length. So 100mm lens is going to work best at 3 meters, and so on. That's just a definition, and that's kind of where it comes from. So in effect, this lens here is going to work best when the rays of light are coming from a long way away, or in effect a parallel. So if I'm putting another lens in front of it, which wasn't manufactured by the manufacturer or wasn't tuned to work with this camera lens, I need to make sure it creates light that's in the format that the lens is going to best deal with. I'm hoping that, again, that makes some sort of sense. If it doesn't, then as I say, that's the point, please, to call out, folks. And so anyway, that's what's going on. So in effect, whatever we use by way of close-up lenses, we have to be very careful. Not that it makes them parallel, but it makes them as near parallel as possible. And clearly that's why one needs a set of these close-up lenses. But in a way, it's doing, you know, what this pair of glasses is doing. You know, I'm looking at this book and I can't read it. The book is Train Spotters for those who are interested. But I put my reading glasses on it. You know, you can read the writing that's the other side of the reading glasses, because it's been bent slightly before it comes through the glasses and enters my eye, or in this occasion rather, the camera lens. So that's all that's going on is exactly the same as is going on with our reading glasses. And in fact, this is how I got started in macro photography. At the time, I had a pretty basic camera. I had a Minolta at the time with the interchangeable viewfinder. You could actually lift the viewfinder out and look straight down into the camera, which was a lovely idea until a ladybird fell into the camera and got caught up in the mechanism. But, you know, it was a great idea, really, for macro when you get down on the ground. And to go with my basic camera, you know, I used my Granny's magnifying glass. And I used to sellotape the Granny's magnifying glass on front of the lens and take the picture. This is a photograph I took in that way. Apologies for the graininess and so on of the photograph. It was taken on film back in about 1973, I think. So it was a long time ago. And if you put it into a competition now, I dare say the judge would tell you lots of things about, you know, blade of grass going across the legs and all this sort of thing, and the specular highlight in the eye, etc., etc., etc. But I have to tell you that our expectations were different in 1973, 74, because I put this into the annual competition of the club I was a member of at the time, and it won the Rose Bowl. You know, it won the best photograph. It looks pretty awful nowadays, but that was a standard. This was a top club as well. I'm not going to mention the club for reasons that will make sense in a moment, because immediately after the presentation, the president, you didn't have a chairman, they had a president of this club. So Diana, you've got to get your status upgraded. But the president came up to me and said, Bob, excellent photograph. How did you take it? I said, well, with a camera. He said, no. What did you use? So I said, a magnifying glass. And you know what? I was disqualified. And the prize was taken away from me because it wasn't, quote, proper photography. But, you know, there we go. They'd felt it was a good enough photograph to award me a high award, but when they felt that I'd done it with a magnifying glass, well, that didn't really count in the purist world that they lived in. But, you know, there we are. That's how I got started. And I did a lot of my early work I was a student at Southampton University. I studied mathematics in my first degree, and that's when I was doing the work in the New Forest. And you know, students couldn't afford expensive equipment in those days. We didn't have the bank of mum and dad to lend us money, so you know, we had to adopt other techniques, and kind of that's what we did. We talk about extension tubes in a while. We used to use toilet paper tubes, you know, the tube from the middle of a toilet roll, painted black, and sellotaped onto the camera. But anyway, look, a modern close-up lens might look something like this. This is a Canon one, doesn't matter what make it is, 250D or 4 diopter. So one way of measuring close-up lenses is in diopters, which is how you measure your spectacles. So if you get close-up reading glasses, you'll know they're plus. If you're short-sighted, you need to see things a long way away, you have minus in your prescription. So this is a +4 diopter or 250. Canon are a bit stupid in some ways because they, everybody else talks in diopters, Canon talk in focal lengths. So this is a 250mm lens. You might think that's odd in the sense it's nothing like 250mm, but it is in effect of how much it bends the light. There's a little formula if you really want to learn it, which converts one to the other. I have to know it because I work with Canon lenses. You don't need to know it really. The effect is the magnification ratio, and this magnification ratio is important because this is the thing that you use if you're going to work out whether those rays of light are nearly parallel. And if you were to use close-up lenses, you need to do that, otherwise you're going to get chromatic aberrations and all sorts of funny things. So this is the sort of the effect. And so, for example, if I wanted a magnification ratio of 0.2 or 1 to 5, much less than 1 to 1. So this is close-up world now, not macro world. 100mm lens, 2 diopter close-up lens, it would give me that. Can you see? And that's going to give me nearly parallel rays of light as well. So you can kind of use that little formula. I wouldn't get too bogged down by that, but I would sort of have the idea in the back of your head and get to know, if you're buying close-up lenses, those which you need to use in different situations. But you're going to see, I'm going to suggest to you in a minute, that really, you know, they're not the best idea. Firstly, they have to be matched to the lens in use, in effect that they have to screw into the filter thread. So this is a 52mm one. You need to be a 52mm filter thread, or you need to step down rings and all these sort of things. They start to produce soft focus and falls off a little bit to the edge simply because they're not made by the manufacturers, unless you buy very good ones. This is a D. D stands for double, because in effect in that lens there are more than one piece of glass, if you like, so that deals with some of the problems, which is why they're a deal more expensive, I suppose. The manufacturers would tell you, of course, that unless you buy a Canon close-up lens to use on a Canon camera, then you'll get bad results and so on, which is absolutely a load of, excuse me, not true. All right. Look, if we look at prices, they're really interesting. This particular one there, it's a 58mm, but it's the same thing. I looked up on Amazon a couple of days ago, and it's £217 on Amazon, you know, a standard place to go. If I buy the Hoya set of 3, or indeed you can even get 4 different ones at 58mm, the Hoya professional ones, that is, which are multiple glass, then they're £50 on Amazon. So, you know, you're paying a lot of money for the name if you're buying Canon or Nikon or whatever his own ones. Go and buy, but buy good ones. Hoya are good ones. You can buy them for £5 on eBay, but they're usually the bottom of a milk bottle or something like that. They're probably not even as good as my granny's magnifying glass. The price is important. What can you do with them? Well, you know, I have a great friend who's a landscape photographer, and I go out with her taking photographs. This was taken off the North Devon coast, and I get rather fed up with landscape because I've not got the patience to stand. I suppose I've got the patience to wait for hours and hours and hours for an otter to appear if I'm trying to photograph those, but not to wait for the light to be hitting the particular rock out at sea or whatever she was doing. So I ended up photographing dandelions or trying to replicate the picture that I mistakenly took all those years ago, or dealing with toadstools. I've got a bit of fungi work. So this is a fly agaric, for those who know their toadstools, and it was taken with some artificial light and with it wasn't quite taken with a close-up lens, but it was in effect done the same way. So it's a bit of a cheat picture, I suppose. So they have their places. They have their place. But, you know, I guess I've given you a suggestion, you know, that they're not my first choice. People go for them because they're very, very reasonable prices. You know, £50 for a set. You know, it's £50 a lot of money, but it's a lot less than some sort of lenses. The next one, however, that I want to look at is where I tend to suggest that people who have just got started in macro and don't want to spend all the money on lenses go. So let's have a look at it. It's called extension tubes or bellows. And again, I can't ask for a show of hands, but I'm guessing that quite a few of you know what we're talking about here. We talk about extension tubes, not bellows nowadays. Bellows are old technology. Bellows were, if you like, infinitely adjustable extension tubes because you could extend or retract them, but they weren't automatic and they didn't do all the sort of things that we long for in extension tubes nowadays. Remember what I said? They're this longer arms type scenario. But if we look at our problem diagram again that we had of photographing the ladybird, remember, you know, the problem is we can't focus on the film. So what do? Well, the solution is very simple. we just move the film to where the ladybird is. All right, so you don't take the back of your camera out and move the sensor. Please, please, please don't do that. You'll invalidate the warranty, I feel sure. And don't go along saying Bob Research came to Bishop Stortford Camera Club and said I'm to do that, because he didn't. But we need to extend that distance somehow or other. All we need to do is put the film where the lens is focusing the image, or the film or sensor, if you like. And we do that using these things called extension tubes. And the way they work are this. Remember, we're talking about sort of longer arms. This is a camera. It's a Canon camera, but again, it doesn't matter what it is. That is the normal lens to film distance, or film or sensor. This little white mark up here, if you don't know, is where the sensor is inside your camera. So the sensor in this camera is lined up with that little tiny white mark, if you can see it up the top there. And the film, the lens has what's called a nodal point. If you're into these things, I'm getting a bit geeky about it now, which for this lens will be about there. So that is the distance between the lens and the film. And what we need to do is we need to increase it. And we increase it by putting extension tubes in. I'm not going to hold one up and demonstrate it, because I guess you hope you can get that from that diagram. But principally, all we're doing is putting a piece of metal in front, a metal tube rather, in front of the lens, front of the camera and between the lens, to increase that distance. All right. And these are called extension tubes. And that's exactly what we use. The great thing about these, the great thing about them, and again, I've put this slide in because I can't, so hold on and demonstrate them to you, is there is nothing in there that is going to affect the image quality. There was an article in Amateur Photographer a while ago now where somebody was saying, or the editor was saying, that extension tubes are yesterday's technology and don't believe anybody who talks about them. And I wrote to the editor and said, well, I'm sorry, I use them a lot in my macro photography. And, they're not yesterday's technology. They're still pretty good nowadays, and a good place to go. And I got a very interesting letter back from him saying, I think you need to go and learn how to take photographs, which I thought was a rather rude response, but I didn't follow him up on that. But you can see there's nothing in the middle of them. I'm going to show you some extension tubes in a minute, but in effect, these are they come in sets of 2 or 3. You can buy them singly as well, but they can come in sets of 2 or 3, and they kind of link together. And they come in different sizes. Different manufacturers make different sizes, but these are 12, 20, and 36 that you're seeing there. And they can be stacked in any combination. So in effect, you could put just the 12mm one in, and you're extending that lens to film distance by 12mm, the 20 or the 36, or the 12 and the 20 making 32, or the 12 and the 36 making 48, or the 20, and so on. You can see, and in effect, you can have all of them together if you want. I did some of the work when I did my FRPS panel on Leicans, and I had to have 2 sets of extension tubes to get some of the magnifications that I wanted to do of some of the very, very tiny Leicans. Lots of problems with that. We may talk about that a bit later on. But they can be stacked in any combination. Whoops. And they're usually automatic. They fully operate with your camera. And I'm going to try and be daring and swap, hopefully, to you can see me. Can you see these extension tubes? Yes. Can you see them? Yes. Yeah. Thanks, Sue. Nodding. Sorry to pick on you, Sue. I saw you nod in the picture there. I don't know whether you can see that these have got, if I hold them up close, they've got little metal, they've got little connections, trying to do this remotely, little connections there inside the lens, which go inside the tube, which go through to connections at the back. So in effect, there's electrical connections from the front to the back of your camera is connecting to the lens. So in effect, what you're doing is my back on. Yeah, thank you. I'm turned to Anne behind me. So in effect, what you're doing is you're allowing your camera to communicate with the lens in the normal way of things, so it can focus, it can do other things. I'm saying that because you can get extension tubes which don't work like that, and that's really, really important. There's a whole little article I'm going to send to Diane or Sophia this evening, whoever I send it to, on extension tubes. It's on my website, you can have a look at it, but it talks about some of the pitfalls. Some of the very cheap extension tubes do not have electrical connections at all, and if they don't, then your camera is going to work in everything in manual mode. You've got to manually focus, manually expose, manually exposure compensate, because they do reduce the light a little bit, and so on. All these sort of issues in order to take the photograph. So you're far better off spending a bit of money on connections through there. Some of them have just metal rods that pass through the, you can probably see these on the little picture. Some of them have just metal rods that pass through inside. If they do, then you're going to, in effect, you're not allowing, the camera doesn't know what's happening to the light that's coming through. So you're going to have to exposure compensate to get the right figure. These have got little computer chips inside each of these tubes, which communicate or take that information, communicate it to the camera in a different way. They say, look, in here, we've done this, if that makes a little bit of sense. And thereby is the problem, because there are people who will tell you, if you go and buy third-party extension tubes, they may not have the right computer chip inside them, and they may damage your camera. And that is true. All right. And the main people who are going to tell you that are, of course, the manufacturers, because they say, well, you know, if you're buying Canon, you buy Canon, Nikon, Panasonic, and so on and so on. You know, that's again a lot of rubbish, but you must make sure you get the right ones. I've had some of these tested by an electrical engineer, and he tells me that those that are made by Kenko and indeed Polaroid, but Kenko are identical to those that are made by Canon. And I can tell you a little story. I probably won't tell you this on air because this is being recorded, but I did actually talk to the man who owned the Kenko factory once and asked him, did he make them for Canon? And he said, well, maybe I do, and maybe I just paint them differently. But in effect, the Canon ones are identical to the Kenko ones. They're made in the same factory, made in the same way. You're paying all the extra money for the paint. And I looked up the Amazon prices last week, and the Kenko set of 3 are £94. A set of 2 for Canon are £256. So there you're paying a lot of money for a bit of paint, really. But you know, do make sure you get the right ones. And the little article to be downloaded from the website. If you're buying secondhand and you're a Canon user and you're using a crop sensor camera, be aware you need to use what are called EFS tubes. So a crop sensor Canon camera is the one with the red and the white focusing dots, and so you need to get extension tubes with a red and a white dot as well. There's a lot more in that article which I'll send out, but do have a look at that if you're shooting on a crop. And if you're buying secondhand, most extension tubes nowadays come, if they're Canon ones, with a red and white dot. Somebody once put their hand up at a presentation and said, that's why I shoot Nikon, Bob. You know, there we go. All right, so the magnification, remember, depends on the length of these tubes that you're using, as does the light. All right, and there's a little formula here, if you like, for it, you know, and you can work it out, if you will. So a 50mm lens with just a 25mm tube is going to give you half magnification. It's still not macro, but it's getting a lot nearer than it did before, and you use a bit of light. This is what the man from Amateur Photographer said to me. Look, you use light, Bob, and as you lose light, that's going to be a problem. And I said to him, well, you know, 1.5 stops. When I started, I was shooting on, you know, ASA, for those who remember it, you know, ASA 25 film. We regularly shoot now on ISO 200, 400 and think nothing of it. And we've got cameras that perform excellently at it. If some of you are shooting with some of the latest mirrorless cameras around, you know, you can go up to massive numbers of ISO. And so 1.5 stops from 25 would be 50, between 50 and 100. And we always shoot more than that. So do you know what? What's the problem is my view on that. But anyway, there we go. Best to experiment. Get a set, go and beg, borrow, and steal. Don't steal. Go and beg, borrow a set from somebody else and try them out and see what you can do. And you can achieve great things. You know, we're talking about your frog, Diane. We saw our first lizard today, which is interesting. Shows you how warm it is. It was a lizard that was caught by the cat, I'm afraid, but the cat had seen it before we had. But this is a common lizard. All right, taken with extension tubes. These are leaf cutter ants. You know, so you can get really quite close up the photographs. You could even get, with enough extension tubes, carefully set up, you can get into, I don't know what moth this is. It was taken at the Stratford upon Avon Butterfly Farm. And I don't know what it was, but you can get some idea. You can get the idea of what's going on there in that picture. And if you start to use them with telephoto lenses, then you can achieve some wonderful things. And this is the one thing that is not really talked about now, but I've used it for a very long time. And I run Dragonfly workshops, or I'm not doing it at the moment, of course, looking at just that. So look, this is a Sympetrum striolatum for those who are into their dragonflies, or a common data a female common darter, and she was taken on a bramble leaf, and I took it out on a family walk, 400mm lens. The problem with the 400mm lens is well, some of the modern ones will, but in those days it wouldn't focus close enough. All right, but it allowed me to be sufficiently far away from the dragonfly so as not to frighten it, which is ideal, of course. So I could walk up, take the photograph, bright daylight, not frighten it, take the photograph and walk away. And I did it by using a 12mm extension tube. And again, I'm not demonstrating it this evening because we haven't got the capacity to do so, but if you try it, put a little 12mm extension tube, the shortest one you can, between your long lens and the camera, you'll find you can focus closer for the reasons that we've been talking about now. So you can get up to the point where this is a full-size dragonfly. So look, I've got it, it's not life size, of course it isn't, it's smaller than that, and I've got it filling the frame of the camera. We'll talk about focus stacking and getting, wings in focus and so on in due course, but dragonflies, it's often best to get the thorax or the body parallel to the plane of focus so that you've got all the detail inside that one. Or, this is another dragonfly. This is a broad-bodied chaser, libellula depressor, a different form of dragonfly, but you can get the idea very quickly taken. I took this when we were going to some open gardens, family outing to some open gardens, queuing up for the teas and scones, and I quickly took the photograph because I could, and a four-spotted chaser, same sort of thing. This is a common darter again, the same one as you saw the female. This is a male. I took this with a 500mm lens with a 25mm extension tube, not because I wanted to be that far away, but because it was in the middle of a pond on a little rock, and I couldn't get close enough to it without getting wet feet, and I wasn't really intending to do that. But you see, the same thing applies. I can get that focus, that magnification with a long lens, telephoto lens, which wouldn't focus that close ordinarily. Their minimum focusing distance would be less than you need, but I can make it do that by putting an extension tube in between. Or this is a thing called a ruddy darter. People say this is the one that I've been trying to photograph because it really well gets out of the way of my photographs. But it's a ruddy darter, or this is an emperor dragonfly. Or you can use the same thing for butterflies. This is a red admiral. All right. And just a little bit of a warning to Diane. I can't see you, Diane, but I can see you. Yeah, the little warning that we're going to introduce a picture of something with 8 legs in a second. So thank you. I'll tell you when we've gone past it. All right. You can do the same thing with that. And I was accused once of saying this must have required a specialist macro lens. No, it didn't. No, it didn't require a specialist macro lens. It required a 150mm lens. We can't get that lens nowadays. It's all right now, Diane. With an extension tube in between. All right. Look, I hope that's given you a bit of a starter to how you don't need expensive equipment. What I'm going to do, and it's just disappeared to make me a drink. What I'm going to do after the break is talk a bit more about specialist lenses and specialist techniques. So apologies to all those you are expert macro photographers and think, do you know what? This guy has come here under false pretenses this evening because he's told me stuff I already knew. But hopefully it's made sense. And for those of you who don't want to get into it because it's expensive, go and buy yourself a set of extension tubes. I think I said they're about £70 now. Not that cheap, but buy a set between 2 of you or whatever. I used to know a club which had 3 or 4 sets they could lend out to members, who wanted to get started in the macro world. So look, I think it's time to go and have a cup of tea, isn't it, Diane?
Yes, it is. Thanks ever so much there, Bob. Crikey, all this physics, I've been trying to concentrate, and I have soaked up lots of it. I have to say, it was my weakest subject at school. Like you, I was in the world of education.
Oh, well, there you are then, important person, you see.
But I am an important person. I was in those days. Not anymore. But no, absolutely brilliant. Thank you. I've got a question actually, because I did all my macro today with I've got an Olympus, and I used my 300 mil lens,
right,
prime lens. Hence, when the frog was getting very close to me, I completely lost it. But I actually quite enjoy using that for macro type photography. but that's not a cheap way of doing it.
It isn't, and I don't know that particular lens, but I suspect it may not focus close enough for you, which is why you can use it with the extension tube. So when I do dragonfly work, or thank you, Anne, or butterflies, I tend to use a long telephoto lens with extension tubes. It allows
So I
me to get
could
closer.
still
So that
get,
300 would work well for you in that sense.
yeah, so I
You could
could
get even closer to your frog.
Yeah, so it could be worth, as a club, getting a few of those. It's a good idea, actually. I'll put it to the committee.
The question is, you get Olympus, Panasonic, whatever. So you sort of draw lines at some point. But I mean,
yeah. But yeah, brilliant, love it.
But do read that article that I'll email on to Diane. Shall I email it to you or to Sophia?
You could do it to both of us if you like.
Can I? Because I've got Sophia's email address, I think.
Yeah, well, that's fine. She shares. She's a very good sharer. So that if you got her email address.
Okay, and then obviously with the recording, so you perhaps don't need it, but you can send them out to people. But the additional notes on things like extension tubes could be helpful.
Okay, there are a couple of questions here. Let me have a look if I can.
I'm going to take a drink if you
box. I'll let you. Actually, David Cutts has said stacking in CS is best done in bridge. Stacking in CS is due.
Can I talk about that in the second half?
Yeah, okay, that's fine.
Because there's lots. I mean, stacking is something that people try to make into a mysterious art. It is not. It is not. And I want to try and dispel it. As I say, it's the latest in thing. I think it's the latest version of what was HDR we all learned to do.
I mean, I must admit, I do it in camera.
You can, and I'll talk about that as well. So let's. Okay. I can see David.
We won't mention that anymore. We won't mention focus stacking anymore because that is happening soon. We got a question here from Dave Pyatt. Am I correct in thinking that depth of field will decrease the greater the extension tube used?
Absolutely. And in those notes that I will send out, it gives you a little table saying how much it does. So yes, it does decrease. I should have said that perhaps. It decreases quite significantly the more extension tubes you use, and which is why you use focus stacking. I talked a little bit about a project I did whereby I was photographing. I had a commission to photograph lichens for lichens, I guess you know what lichens are, the sort of things that grow on rocks, etc., and branches, for a book that was being published on lichens. And the National Lichen Collection at the time was in the basement of Taunton Museum. And if you know Taunton at all, Taunton was right beside the museum was right beside the main railway station. So I was having to use lots of extension tubes, which gave me great problems with depth of field. So because I used two sets, so we're down to fractions of a millimeter in depth of field. So I was having to do some stacking in transparencies, which is an interesting concept. And also, not only are we worried then about the depth of field, we're also worried about movement because it's all magnified, of course. So I had to stop when the express train was going through. So I was working in the basement with the train timetable, and I stopped my photography when I knew that the London Express was going through, or the Devon Express going the opposite way. I made a cup of tea when I waited for it to go through. So yeah, lots of problems. I forget who asked the question, but absolutely right. Depth of field drops off massively.
Brilliant, thank you. And there's a question from Mark. With the telephoto lens, can you use the zoom telephoto lenses as well as the prime lens?
Yes, you can. And in fact, when I do things with telephoto lens, and if I was in a club in person, I'll be demonstrating this. I do it with a 100 to 400 millimeter lens and extension tubes and demonstrate. I usually bring along a paper butterfly and pin it up on the other side of the room, and use it as a little model and try to convince people that I've trained this butterfly to sit still. But we then project it onto the screen so you can see what's going on. Yeah, so it gives you the ability to zoom in and out. So yeah, I would recommend it. And zoom lenses are as good quality. Zoom lenses are as good as prime lenses nowadays, I think. I mean, there are times when they're not, but by and large, they're as good a quality now, good quality ones as prime lenses.
Okay, and a question here from Dave: do you recommend the use of a focus rail?
I'm going to talk about that in the second half. This is
okay. All right, we'll wait for that then.
I've got one here.
Fair enough. Yeah, I've only heard of those recently.
right.
Yeah, be interested to hear what you say about those. Yeah, okay. Any other questions, anyone?
You can go and get a cup of tea, you know.
You can unmute yourselves, or you can go and get a cup of tea, or
I've got a cup of tea.
you've got a cup of tea. Oh. Okay, well,
so I will share
we can
screens
mute
again then,
ourselves
if I
again.
can. So hopefully that's shared screen again.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anne, telling me from behind. Let me just move this around so I can see what I'm doing. And I've still got my red dot. Right, so this, by the way, is a wasp, of course. This really is, you know, close-up photography, as you can see. This is macro photography taken without stacking. I was standing on top of a step ladder with my head in the plum tree because the wasp was feeding on the plums. So it was a bit dozy. So because it was intoxicated, I suppose. So I could get up quite close to it. But you get the idea of what can be done. Let's have a look at that a little bit later. I do run a lot of safaris in Africa, and I swap into Swahili occasionally, so apologies. I was about to say Badai then, which is, for those who speak Swahili will know that's later, so apologies if I slip occasionally. So macro photography, welcome back. Look, remember the problem we had? The camera is inostensibly long-sighted. You know, I've admitted to having to wear these things to read these days. I find that if I'm trying to look at the phone close up, I really do need reading glasses. Can't see that which is too close. And we've looked at two examples for solving that, if you will. The spectacle screw-in lenses, I don't like them, but you know, they do work. The extension tubes, I think, really are a fantastic place to start. And Dave, you're quite right to hang on to yours. And the people who wouldn't buy them were very foolish. But let's have a look at these specialist macro lenses nowadays. These things are what cost you a lot of money. And I always say that I'm going to suggest to you that macro lenses might save your marriage or might ruin your marriage. And I'll give you the ideas of both. And I'm joking, of course, but you'll get the idea in a minute. Look, what we're talking about is these macro business. We're talking about these specialist macro eye for thready needles, to go back to our thoughts of earlier. Okay. And many lenses claim to have a macro function, you know, but very few have the ability to do closer than 1-to-1. Look, you know, my late mother used to always have this saying, which as kids used to annoy us. She used to say that it says Hovis on the side of buses, but they're not made of bread. But which is probably doesn't make sense to some of you who don't know about bus signs and Hovis, but there we are. And it used to annoy us. But if it says macro on a lens, it doesn't mean to say that it's a macro lens. I'll give you a way of testing them in a minute. Remember our definition, you know, this is where we are now. Anything closer than 6 inches doesn't require a macroscope. We're going to call macro. So true macro lenses permit us to go up to life size or greater. And this is the defining point. Okay, so that lens which Anne gave me earlier on says macro on the side of it. It will allow me to go up to where's the I can't find it. I'll find it in a minute. That one there. Can you get that one out for me? It'll allow you to get up to life size or greater. I'm going to talk to you about a lens in a minute or two, which Anne's now getting out of its case for me. Good job you're here. We'll talk about this lens, which allows you to get up to 5 times life size. So there are very, very few lenses that will do that. And this lens, I don't even think it says macro on the side of it, actually. But there we are. So very specialist lenses. How do they do it? They do it by having built-in extension tubes. So in effect, 100mm macro, it does say macro, says Anne, just showing me. They have built-in extension tubes, which in effect are doing the same as putting extension tubes in front of a lens. And I tried pointing this out to the Canon people who said, I can't tell the difference between the two pictures. And I said, well, the difference is that one of your lenses has got extension tubes in, and one of them I added them. In effect, they're bellows. And they're sort of paper things. If you were to take, please don't do it, but Dave, if you were to take your 100mm macro lens apart, you'd find some paper. They're actually made of a thin plastic actually inside that lens, bellows which go in and out. And in effect, the early macro lenses used to get longer when you went into the macro world. We're going to, I don't know if you can see this lens. I'll do a full frame of it later on, but you can see that as this lens gets closer and closer, it gets longer. And that was the problem, because there are bellows inside it, which are having to extend it. But thankfully, modern macro lenses don't require that, because they have what are called specialist floating lens structures. So in other words, as the bellows make the lens longer, the optics, the glass, gets closer together. So the net effect is the whole thing stays the same length. If you've got Sigma macro lenses, you will know that some of the earlier Sigma ones got longer, for example. And they're more expensive. Yeah, of course they're more expensive, and because they've got a lot more technology inside them. And you know, good quality macro lenses can cost 5, 6, 7, 800, 900 pounds. I mean, a lot of money, you know, from them. But they have a benefit, you know. And what's their benefit? Well, their benefit is convenience value. All right. Now, if you think about this, if I were to have a normal lens and extension tubes, I'd need to take my lens off my camera and put my extension tubes in when I got to the point where my frog Diane was too close to me. All right, I'd have to take off and put extension tubes in when eventually you're going to get to the point where it's closer than your lens will focus. But the benefit of a macro lens is it will go through that point without. These are awful pictures. I must swap them one of these days. But they're snowdrops in a in a churchyard, not far from me. So you can see, look, you know, there's a churchyard full of snowdrops. There are getting a bit closer. You know, this is getting even closer still. And you know what? You can get right in close like that without having to swap anything. So that was the same lens on the same camera to do all that sequence of photographs. Or, you know, for those who want to photograph orchids, this is a common spotted orchid. For those who are into their orchids, you know, you can get right up close without having to swap anything. I do a lot of work with carnivorous plants. These are some carnivorous plants in the nursery of Oxford Botanical Gardens, which is where I don't go nowadays for various reasons, largely because they get visitors who tend to damage them. So I go to a private nursery now where he grows specialist carnivorous plants, specialist breeder to do the pictures. But look, this is a sundew. But it's not a sundew, it's a Venus flytrap, says he. And this Venus flytrap is about to trap an ant. All right, so for those of you who are members of the Save the Ant Foundation or the RSPCA, you might wish to complain now. Look, don't worry, no ant was harmed because this particular Venus flytrap had been damaged. I'm going to suggest by a little boy, but it might have been a little girl, poking it with their biro to see if it snapped shut. And he did it so many times that it broke it, and it isn't going to catch that ant. So the ant on this day got away completely freely. All right. Diane, I'm looking at you. I'm not sure if there are any other arachnophobes in the audience, but if we look at the same sort of effect that I had earlier, this is a different eight-legged beastie. And, you know, remember I said, you know, that you can have problems if you have I'm very, very lucky in that my other half is an excellent photographer and a very keen, competent photographer as well. But if you go out on this family walk and you suddenly find a spider and you put your camera bag down because you want to photograph it, and you have to get your camera out, you have to get the extension tubes, you take the lens off, you know what goes on, you know, it's, oh, for goodness sake, we come out on the family walk, can't we keep up, you know? You know, if you have a macro lens, it's going to save your marriage because you can quickly take the photograph and join the rest of the group. You know, get the joke. But if your other half is not sympathetic and finds out what you spent on that lens, well, anyway, I'll leave you to work that one out. All right. So it's convenience value, really. If you're going to buy one, there are a number of them around. Again, when I come do these things in person, I bring a whole set of a kit and lay it out on the table in front. So you can get sort of 60mm macro lenses, you can get 50mm, you can get all sorts of different ones. If they're too short, they're going to mean that you have to get very close to the subject. All right, so you're better off if you're doing skittish subjects like wildlife subjects to get a longer one. And so I always suggest something between 90 and 110. There's 150mm made by some people. There used to be a 200mm macro lens made by Leica, which was an absolutely fantastic lens. They don't make it any longer. Well, they do make it longer. It's not 200mm. Don't make it any more, shall I say? But you know, 100mm, 105mm, excellent lenses. They can be used with tubes. So I forget who it was saying that they're using with tubes. Was it you, Sue? Was it earlier on? Yeah, you can use it with tubes to get even closer. So if you think about it, that macro lens that Anne had earlier on the camera will have its own minimum focusing distance. It's a lot closer than would ordinarily be the case with a 100mm lens, but it is such that you get 1-to-1. That's what it's designed for. That's where macro comes to. If I want to go closer than 1-to-1, I need to put extension tubes in there to get even closer. And as I say, I do workshops on carnivorous plants, which are tiny little things. And you can get some excellent photographs of carnivorous plants with a normal macro lens with extension tubes. So, you know, don't think, well, I've spent all my money on macro lens, go and buy the tubes as well, or buy the tubes first and then whichever way around, and put the two together and you can do exceptionally well. Or remember the longer lenses for things that are further away. They often have fittings on them for what are called ring lights. We'll talk about ring lights in a minute, in a little while. We'll talk about lighting. This little groove around the front is for a ring light to attach, and I've got a ring light here. We can demonstrate that with, if I can make it work. They have a bonus as well, which I knew nothing about until I did a talk to a Society of sorry. Was a Society of Librarians. They were basically looking at maps and so on. They were looking to photograph maps. And the problem with normal lenses, of course, you'll know that the archivist, that's what I was looking at, the word I was looking for, is that the lines towards the edge of the lens, if you can see me in the picture there, they tend to splay out, don't they? A normal lens, you get this sort of barrel distortion. And somebody said to me, do you know that doesn't happen with the macro lens? And I said, well, I didn't. And so I've tried it, and in fact it doesn't. So there is a benefit if you're photographing flat images like books, etc. I think I've now worked out why that is. I won't bore you with it, but it's just a little benefit, not close up, or not macro, but close up, I suppose. Right, so we've dealt with the three possibilities. Now let's say we want to go to higher magnifications. Now I've just said you can do it with a macro lens with extension tubes, but there are some specialist lenses around. There's one made by a company called Iowa at the moment, which I haven't had a chance to test, but is getting some rave reviews. There are various different macro lens adapters that you can screw on the front of your normal lens, which really I'm going to suggest are a waste of your hard-earned pennies, because they really cause you more problems than they're worth. If you are, and I'm not, advocating one camera manufacturer, and unfortunately only one manufacturer makes this lens at the moment, but Canon make a lovely lens which goes, and if you can see, I'm going to stop the share so you can see this a bit closer if I can. So if I do that, you should now see me as full screen. Yes. I can't at the moment, no. Can you all see me as full screen? No, you can't.
Yes, we can.
Oh, you can.
Yes,
Right.
can,
Okay. Yeah. Brilliant. Okay. So you've got this lens here. I mean, if I do a clever little trick, maybe you can now see it even closer.
Oh, wait, further away.
Further away, says Anne. Thank you. All right. You can see it says 1 to 5 down the side of that lens. I don't know if you can see it in person. There, can you see it now in yellow writing? It's upside down, isn't it?
Yeah, see it.
All right, so you can get the idea. So this lens goes up to 1 to 5 times magnification. Let's go back to the presentation again, and that has its benefits. So let's just have a look at what this lens will do for us for a minute, as a way. I've got my, come on, wake up, computer. Right. So this is the lens that I've just shown you. It has this horrible habit of getting longer as you work with it. But to me, I use it a lot for my macro work. You can buy them. You can buy them for Nikon cameras. I don't know about Olympus and Panasonic, although the Iowa one, I'm told, is very, very good. I've not used one. But the ones that you buy for Nikon particularly are made by another manufacturer and are very, very expensive indeed. This one isn't cheap. But I think it's a fantastic lens. It's a pleasure to use. Delivers great results. Is extremely well. I'm not a Canon salesman, by the way. Okay, because it has some downsides. It has no focus control. All right, it has no focus control on it. Your focus is done by moving backwards and forwards towards the subject. Okay, and the viewfinder gets extremely dark beyond 3 times magnification and really dark at 5 times. So you need auxiliary lighting. We talked to depth of field. The depth of field at f16, which for the purist is not f16, it's f45, but let's not worry about that, is 122 millimeters at 3 times. I forgot who it was asking about depth of field earlier. Dave, no, who was it? Somebody asking about depth of field in the break. And it's 1/4 millimeter at 5 times magnification. Now, 1/4 millimeter isn't very much, so we do need to do special things about that. And it's quite heavy and requires a tripod they say at high magnifications, although I don't use a tripod very much with it because I think I can hold it still enough, but you know, with a high enough shutter speed, etc. And it's not a fixed length. You know, you saw as I extended this one, you know, if you're photographing maybe a plant, you're going to get it close, you're going to knock the plant over, or you might bump into the plant and get dirt on the front of the lens. And you know, it's not cheap. I looked up that price yesterday, and it's £1,069. You can get them cheaper in some places, but you know, there. What can you do with it when we start looking into macro world? Now, I was asked by Canon, a chap called Eldon Lechtenberg, who's one of the marketing directors at Canon USA at the time. The name of that, he's got to be American, hasn't he, really? Can we do some demonstration photographs? So we were at the Canon research department at Ruislip, and we went outside and I found this thing. It's called a Harvestman. Are these worrying as well, Diane? You're happy with Harvestman? Good. I should have warned if not. We all know what Harvestman is like. You know, they are arachnids. They've got 8 legs, but they're different to spiders, of course. And this is on a geranium leaf, a cultivar geranium, not a wild geranium, of course. So, you know, red flower geranium. And you get idea of the size. You know the size. This is life size. In other words, if I were to take that on a 35mm transparency and hold the transparency over the bug, the Harvestman, it would be life size. Okay, this is twice life size, 3 times life size. Okay, you can see this little Harvestman, he wouldn't do as he's told. He didn't stay still. So between my taking photographs, he moved slightly, but let's not worry too much about that, you know. So with that one lens, or indeed the Iowa lens nowadays, you can get up to 5 times magnification without doing anything. And gracious me, if you use extension tubes with it, you can get up to, you know, I think it was Sue asking earlier, put that lens in with extension tubes, Sue, you can get up to, you know, 10 times, 15 times life size. You can get to really, really high magnifications. And if you use it, so in effect, it's going from there to there within one lens. If you use it with a crop sensor camera, you know, 1.6 crop sensor, you can get up to, well, about 7.5 times life size. And indeed, that's how I took this photograph of the wasp. It wasn't, it was about almost 2 and a bit times life size in effect, but you know, and look, whoever it was asked about depth of field, you know, the depth of field, I've got the head of the wasp perfectly well in focus, but it's dropping away as it goes down the back of the wasp. Can you see? And the wings are out of focus. I hadn't got a problem with that. I wanted this thing is called the shield on a wasp. This is a common wasp. It's nothing special. He might think he's special, but he's a common wasp. And I wanted the shield and this sort of fur or hair and the head to be in focus. I used a ring light. You can see the ring light reflection in one of its false eyes here, and that causes slight problems with the antennae in terms of almost looking halos around them. But you can see what I'm doing, and I hadn't a problem with it going out of focus. But you know, a focus stacked image wouldn't be like that. Diane, I'm sorry again. All right. You can do the same thing with your spider. So this is getting in really, really close to us. I'll get rid of the spider now very quickly. Look, I talked about hairs on stinging nettles. So this is a stinging nettle. This was taken in the garden. I went and I got the stinging nettle and I clamped it to a bamboo cane. I got a close peg and I taped it to the bamboo cane and I clamped the stinging nettle with the close peg, as you do. I put the tripod on the camera, or even the camera on the tripod, so it was held still, and I took that photograph. So you can start to see the hairs on a stinging nettle. And if you start going in really close with that lens and extension tubes, you can start to see the hairs very close up. And if you sort of do it with black backlit, and actually that doesn't require a black piece of cloth. What that requires is that you light the subject from an angle so that there's no light falling on the background. So in effect, the background is way out of exposure range and looks to be black. Does that make some sort of sense? Okay, I'll show you another photograph later on about that. But look, you can see why they sting. That little needle bit sticks inside you, and then as you move around, this little sac of formic acid moves, squidges the little injection down inside you. We're all used to getting injections at the moment. We are all boasting about our injections. Some of us, we get emails every day. I've had my vaccination. You know, well, this is a vaccination you don't really want, but that's actually what's going on. So it took me a long time to take that photograph. I also take photographs of carnivorous plants. So I've said to you, this is a sundew. A sundew, you know the sort of thing. The rosettes curl over to trap some poor unsuspecting insect inside. And again, you know, I've got some stacked images I'll show you in a while. I'm not too worried about that not being in focus. Look, 7.5 millimeters, you know, so we're getting in really, really quite small now with extension tubes on a macro lens. And if you really want to push the boat out, you can get in really close indeed. This is a stacked image, or at least stacked insofar as the little points of stickiness are concerned. By the way, they used to use this sticky substance on the back of some postage stamps a long time ago. So, you know, there are some real uses for it as well. If you want to get something really ethereal, you can get down on the same level as a sundew and get to see what's actually going on. This was taken, you know, with this lens with extension tubes, but equally I could have taken that photograph with 100mm macro with probably 50 or millimeters of extension tubes and got away with it and got the same sort of magnification. All right, so hopefully I'm giving you some sort of idea about what can be achieved now. By the way, can you all hear me all right? Because I've moved away from the microphone. Let me get a bit closer. So we've looked at these 3 solutions. What I want to do is I want to use the last half an hour I think I've got here to look at some other techniques and other ideas as well. All right. And one thing that nobody asked me about in the interval, but I usually do get asked about, so is this thing about reversing lenses. If you read any books on macro photography, they'll talk to you about reversing the lenses to get up close. And in fact, I've done that and done some exceptional things with it. I'll give you some commentary in a minute. But I'm told, some people will say to you, that extension tubes and bellows disrupt this process. They do to a degree. I mean, I'm talking about now, sorry, as standard lenses. You know, in other words, if you take a standard 100mm lens or 200mm or your 300mm lens with your frog, Diane, and you start putting in tubes and bellows in, you can get to the point where you get chromatic aberrations or distortions. If you get above a certain magnification, and I did some experimenting a few years ago when I sat down and I spent an afternoon with lots of different lenses trying this out. And I reckoned with good quality lenses, when you get above twice life size, you start to see the problem. With poor quality lenses, when you get up to about 1 times life size, you know, and with some really good lenses I used a 300 2.8 Diane on my camera, and I could get up to 5 times life size with extension tubes without seeing a problem. But nonetheless, the problem starts to come in. And there is a solution, and the solution is usually, we're told, to reverse the lenses. What does that mean? Well, look, the top picture here is our conventional photograph of our still life. So in this instance, the distance from the subject to the lens is much greater. Can you see that red dot? Yes? Yeah. Is much further than the distance from the lens to the film or the sensor. Yeah. So, and that's the way a lens is designed. Remember, I told you lenses used to be designed on 30 times the focal length. So this distance is much greater. All right. When I look at our macro shot, what I've done is I've used extension tubes to make this distance greater. So I've now got a point where that is less than that. Yeah. When we get to that situation, and I said to you, it depends on the quality of the lens, but you get to a point where that, if that is more than so much more than that, it tends to break the image up. And we need to think about how we're going to deal with that. Now, as I say, with good quality lenses, I don't think you really need to worry about it until you get into very, very high magnifications. And then there are other solutions as well, which come back to this focus stacking idea, I guess. Look, if I put that lens into there, that's an 85mm normal standard lens, all right? What does reverse lenses mean? It means this. If I look at the rays of light for that lens, they would be something like that, the red rays, back to our diagram. If I just turn that lens around, can you see the red rays are very nearly now what it is that the macro world is wanting? In other words, how the lens is performing, or sorry, the lens is being used in the way it's designed to perform, such that that distance is greater than that distance. It doesn't matter that it's backwards on. All right, and you can do that, and you can get, and it's upstairs in my camera bag, but you can get what are called reversing rings. In the notes I'm going to send out, there are some examples of those, which basically screw into or go into the mount on your camera, and then they fit the you've got a normal lens.
Yep.
And they fit the filter thread on your lens, which is going to appear in a minute. Thank you. All right, so this is a normal, this is a 100mm macro lens, this happens, but here would be your camera ordinarily. If I was to turn it around like that, I put a little metal tube into the camera, which goes into the camera mount, so it needs to be Canon, Nikon, Panasonic, whatever. And then the other end of that has got a filter thread, which will match this, and I can then screw the lens on to the filter thread. So the lens, if my hand is the camera, the lens has been reversed. Are you with me? Obviously, you'd have extension tubes in there as well, because that's the point in doing it, isn't it? All right, but you've reversed the lens. There are problems with that in that this part, you know, the working parts of your lens is where the dirt is going to go in. So you have to be very careful, plus the fact that the lens can no longer communicate with the camera. All right, so the lens won't stop down. Now, we're seeing some wonderful things on mirrorless cameras nowadays where you can manually stop the lens down. Now, those of you who are older than anybody in this audience, none of you are old enough to remember conventional photography where you used to have a ring on your camera that you turn to stop down the lens. You see, I'm expecting some grins in the room. I'm not seeing them there. You're all too young, you see, to remember that. We're now seeing some mirrorless cameras offering that ring back again. But there are tricks you can use to get around that if you want to reverse the lens. Principally, they are these. If you put your lens on your camera in the normal fashion, you press the stop down button, which is in different places on different cameras. In other words, the stop down preview, yeah? And then holding that button down, you take the lens off and you let go of that button, the lens will stay stopped down. You with me? You can then turn it around and put it on your camera. Bit of a fuss, but you know, you can sort of do that. The other way of doing it, if you find you want to do this often, and you know, it's the sort of thing that you might want to do frequently, is you can get, thank you, love. I have a great assistant here. She just pops in and hands me stuff. You see, this is what you all need, really. No. You can get these devices which go between the camera and the lens. This is one made by a company called forgot the name of it. It doesn't matter. But these are very, very expensive. This is one made by a company called Mica. You can probably see it written on the side of it there. But again, this is in the notes that I send out. And it's a lot, if you do it often, it's a lot cheaper. This one is about 60 or 70 pounds. So it's, you know, it's an expensive gadget, but it'll do the prices. Basically what's going on is this bit, can you see this or not on your screen? Can you see me? Yeah. Yep. So this bit here has got the connections in, which connect to the lens. Yeah. Okay. And those connections go through the wire. This bit connects to your camera rather, and it goes through the wire to this bit, which goes on the back end of the lens, so connects it through to the lens. You with me? So any communications between camera and lens are made along this piece of wire, and it kind of works. So, you know, if you do this often, and you're into the world where you're doing very high magnification and you want to use reverse lenses, then, you know, this is a useful device. But don't go and spend the Novatech is the company I was talking about. Novatech's price of sort of £400 or £500. Instead, spend the money on buying this one from Mica. I use it and it works remarkably well for that purpose. The other issue that we have is, and it's linked to, we had the question about depth of field earlier on, and you all know, I'm guessing, and if you don't, I'm not really covering it tonight, but you probably all realize that depth of field in the ordinary circumstances is controlled by aperture. It's controlled by length of lens and various things, but are you all aware of that? The f-stop controls the depth of field. So when one tends to use small f-stops in order to get large depth of field, so by small I mean big numbers, of course 16 is smaller than 8 and so on. I'm guessing that will make sense. If it doesn't, please ask somebody else in the club. You seem a friendly club, help people out. Then you're going to need more light. All right. So there are often, there are occasions, by the way, where in the macro world, I would not use F16 or F22. We'll talk about that with stacking in a minute. So we need to use extra lighting, and I'm going to suggest that in the close-up or macro world, you need a light source that allows you to use small apertures to get that depth of field. And the normal light source that I've always played with is a flash. The problem with, and I'm going to suggest that in extreme macro, it's an almost essential addition because it provides an independent light source, allowing you to work in different lighting. I'm going to need that in a minute. It permits you to use high shutter speeds, because if a flash, although a lot of flashes are synced to cameras nowadays, and so you can get to a speed of 200 or whatever, or high speed sync. I'm not really into the flash world this evening because I haven't really got the time for it. I was just intrigued at the person who was saying that they spent today trying to photograph high speed birds. I did some work with Stephen Dalton, who you may know of, who did a lot of close-up work and high-speed stuff years and years ago, with manually made flash guns, which were basically dustbins full of rolls of silver foil covered in a paste that we used to put beside a pond in order to photograph swallows coming through the pond, so our high-speed moving birds. And they worked really well until one day one of these barrels turned over and fell in the pond and short-circuited, and a great mushroom cloud of water rose into the air, and then we ended up with lots of fish floating on top of the pond. And then we had to go and admit to the person who owned the pond what we'd done as damage to his fish. So flashes have got their problems. They're a lot more sophisticated nowadays than they were in those days when we used to make them ourselves. But anyway, they allow you small apertures, all right? They allow you small apertures and hence a greater depth of field, and they arrest fast movement. And I'm going to suggest as well, they add a sparkle or vibrancy. Now, one of the things that I discovered very early on in my macro work was that if one takes a photograph of something that's small, a mushroom, a toast, or a flower, whatever it might be, and you put it into a competition, the judge is going to turn around and say, as judges are wont to do, golly, that's a very nice photograph, but it's not vibrant enough, or it's not bright enough. Well, I know we can play with those sort of things on sliders in Lightroom and so on nowadays, but we couldn't in the early days when I started. And so what I discovered was that there's something about the human eye, when it sees things close up, it expects them to be more vibrant and brighter than they really are. And the flash adds that back in again. So my friend Stan, I talked about, who goes and photographs jewelry for a living, uses a flash because it adds that vibrancy. So when somebody sees their close-up of a beautiful diamond ring, it looks like what they expect it to look like, even though it does, if that all makes some sort of sense. All right, so it adds that sort of extra sparkle back again. Can be difficult to position, look, whoops, I've tried all sorts of things in the past, bits of Meccano to get the flashlight up near the close to the lens. That's rather an old camera nowadays, but same sort of thing applied. And then we discovered what I call my favorite, which is a ring flash. I don't know if any of you have ever played with ring flashes, but this is a ring flash. There is a image on the screen there. I've got one in a bag here. So it's made up of two bits, really. This bit goes on the top of the camera. This bit goes on the front of the lens. So I talked about that groove on the front of the lens earlier. I don't know if you can see this on your screen. Yeah, it clicks into that groove somehow or other. Oh, I've got a lens cap on. Take the lens cap off first. Does help. And it clicks into that groove, so it stays attached to the lens, in front of the lens, and this other bit goes on the back of the camera. I'm guessing some of you use ring flashes, but for those of you who haven't, let me just move that out of the way. Give you some sort of idea what's going on. It makes macro shooting easy because if you think about it, the light is right up against the subject. Okay, so you're getting the best delivery from the light. All right, it saves the lens casting a shadow. If you imagine what I was doing by putting my flash gun level with the front of the lens with my Meccano, was I was putting it so it didn't cast a shadow. If it was on the back of the camera, it would cast a shadow of the lens, wouldn't it? Or parallax, if you like. It doesn't cause that problem. Okay, it allows us to use very small apertures and fast shutter speeds, and it gives something called even frontal illumination. I'm guessing that none of you don't know what that is, but look, this is my friend Stan again. He makes model bicycles because somebody's got to, I suppose. But this is a bicycle. That wheel is about the size of a 2p piece. So you get the idea of this bicycle, and you can actually take the wheel out. It's got little wing nut things here, so you can undo it and take the wheel out. And it's got or be a rubber chain, and the pedal goes around and wheels the wheel. It's even got brakes that work. You know, he's very fond of what he does, and a seat which is far too small to be comfortable. But there we go. But look, this was taken with a normal flash gun, so you've got all these shadows. If you take it with a ring flash, you've got no shadows. So that's what's flat frontal even illumination. Dentists use them to take photographs of your teeth, if any of you have ever had them. Goodness knows how they. Well, I can give you the answer to this, but you get that inside your mouth takes a bit of doing, really. But I was asked by my dentist a while ago to give him a lesson on this, and so I hope none of you live near enough to me to use the same dentist. So I don't think I'm giving anything away here, really. But he asked me into his consulting room one day, and he told this patient who was sitting in the chair, "This is a fellow dentist, and he's coming to take your photograph." And I wasn't a fellow dentist. So I am a doctor, but a PhD doctor, not a real doctor. But he introduced me as, "This is Dr. Bryn Search," which is correct, but not the right sort of doctor. He's going to take your photographs. And so I took these photographs to show my dentist how to use them. And you don't actually stick that in front of their mouth. You can use it with a long lens, but you know, it gives you nice, even pictures of your teeth. I'm not going to show you my teeth because they're horrible and ugly, but you get the idea about what's going on there. Okay, it has these twin flash tubes, one on either side of the tube, of the ring rather, and you can in fact make one brighter than the other, so you can get shadows like you might use with studio lights. And in fact, you can get them nowadays, which have got two separate little flash guns that stick out either side of the lens, or even three flash guns, so you can be a bit cleverer if you want. But the great thing about them is you can set your camera in manual mode. I don't use manual mode, so wildlife photography very much, but that's not the time to talk about that perhaps. But and a small aperture, fast shutter speed, and the flash is completely automatic. In other words, I don't need to worry. I can choose my ISO as nice and low to get me little noise. I can choose my small aperture to get me depth of field, a deeper depth of field as I want, and I can use a fast shutter speed to arrest movement. There are shortfalls. You know, people will tell you the flash takes over the shot, and they do. I mean, this ring flash, the light will only travel about 30 centimeters, from you. So anything, if this is the camera and this is the subject, anything that's beyond here is going to have no light on it from the flash. So if under normal exposure terms, whatever settings, this is underexposed, it'll appear black. I talked about black backgrounds earlier on. That's how you're going to get a black background. Okay, because the light only gets to there, it's not going to go to here. So anything that's here is just going to be too dark to see. I like the effect because it removes the distraction. Look, here is a Sympetrum, no, it's not a Sympetrum, it's a pitcher plant, and it's a purple pitcher plant, and it's the ones in the background. This is at the nursery I use, are slightly darker. Because there's not so much light falling on them. So it tends to make you focus on that particular one. Sarracenia is the word I'm looking for. So this is the yellow Sarracenia, or Sarracenia flavia. And you can see there's one behind it, but you really don't notice that. And look, take it to the extreme. I was doing my carnivorous plant workshop, and somebody spotted on one of the sundews that it had caught a fly. And they said, "Oh, gracious, can we move it, please, somewhere where we've got a black background?" This is a plant in a pot, of course. And I said, well, yeah, trouble is the fly will probably get away, which might be good for the fly, but it will ruin your photograph. So I said, look, listen to me very carefully. Borrow my ring light, each one of you, and put it sufficiently far away from the background, all right? And adjust your exposure such that the background is going to have no light. So in other words, if you didn't have the flash gun, the background would appear black because it's underexposed, yeah? And the flash gun is going to provide the light. I can see on my screen, you probably can't see, there is another one of these leaflets. These are leaflets. I can just see it here. You may or not see it on your screen. I don't know. Under Zoom, you probably can't. You can't usually see it in a hall under projected image, but it's so badly lit that you don't see it. So you tend to focus. One tends to focus on the subject, which is the fly caught in the sundew. By the way, that fly did not survive, I'm afraid, for those of you who are members of the Preservation of Fly Society. This is a photograph I did not take. I had a lady on a workshop with me, and it was a workshop to do dragonflies, actually. And she said, look, Bob, I've always wanted to photograph pond skaters, you know, the things that whiz around top of the pond. And I can never do it because they move too blinking fast for me. I said, look, listen, try this. So what I did is I gave her a camera with a macro lens, borrowed mine. She had the same camera, but she hadn't got the right setup, and a flash and a ring light. And we just set the thing in manual, so you weren't worried about the exposure now. And I just said to her, look, lean over the pond. Please don't fall in because it's my camera, but lean over the pond and follow the pond skater around and making sure you focus on it. We use back button focus for those of you who know what I'm talking about, to make sure it's in position. And when it is, take the picture. You're not worried about exposure because the ring light is doing it all. And she took 6 photographs, of which 5 were as good as that. All right, I think there are problems with it in the sense that it's cropped bits and pieces, but you know, she was absolutely over the moon with the photograph. All right, I went ahead and I had a friend around at one point, and we set ourselves the task of photographing black fly on dogwood in the garden. You know, I mean, dogwood, you know, the red things, and these aphids, black fly, were being milked by ants. This is Myrmica, the red ant, if you like, and it was milking these black fly, stroked them on the bottom, and they exuded honeydew, which the ants collected. So those of you know, so you know, you can do some great things with that. The trouble with ring lights is they are very expensive. The one I showed you there is about £700. So I was always looking for an alternative. And a chap from Canon once said to me, he used to be the technical director of Canon, have you ever come across these, Bob? I don't know if any of you have come across these, but these are superb little lights. These are made, and again, these are in the notes that I'm going to send to Diane and Sophia. There are lots of them around. I have to tell you the best, and I've got no interest in the company, the best of these made by a company called Newer, and the best model is that model. They make a 160 as well. The 160 isn't as bright. The 216 is bright. They make a 300, which is less bright than the 200. So the 216 is the best. They have interchangeable batteries in the back of them. All right, they are in fact Sony camera batteries. Indeed, this one isn't a Sony camera battery. It's made by somebody else. All right, so you know, because they're the cheap ones. It doesn't have to be a genuine, the genuine article. You can in fact put normal dry cells in the back as well. It's got little springs in it. Where is it? There. But what does it do? Well, it gives you very bright. If I'm in a room doing a presentation, I tend to sort of show this across the room, and people get very startled by it. You can't really see how bright it is in this Zoom thing, but you get the idea. And I think it's causing all sorts of problems with the camera. I get the idea. All right, very, very good. These are dead expensive. They cost about £25. All right, the batteries usually cost more than the light. If you order them from Japan, you know, you have to wait a bit longer, especially if they're on those container ship that's stuck in the, actually, I think it's moving now in the Suez Canal, isn't it? But the one that was stuck in the Suez Canal. If you order them from Japan, they cost more. If you order them on Amazon, they cost something like £40 or so. So a bit more, but you get them quicker. So it's up to you, really. But they're very cheap. I do a lot of workshops on plants, and I used to do some fungi workshops. And I used to take 8 of these along to the workshop for people to borrow. You can stick them in the ground on a spike. If you're a fisherman, fisherwoman, you can get spikes with these same threads on them. You know, it's a 1/4-inch thread for a tripod. You stick it on that, stick it in the ground, and you use it to light flowers and so on. So very useful little device to have. But there's another alternative nowadays. You know, look, this is the ring flash I talked about, £749 2 days ago when I looked it up on Wex. Sorry, on A Camera Company. There are others available. This is another one. Now, this one was sent to me. This one on the right, you may think, well, it looks very similar, doesn't it? Actually, I'm not sure why I blacked out the name of the camera on that one, but I have, but it doesn't matter. It was sent to me by the technical director of Canon and said, look, give this a try, Bob. And I guess you can see the make. It's made by this company called, and I can never pronounce it, Yong'anyo. And look, they're a bit cheeky. It's even got the same number convention as the Canon one. And I tested it and I said to this, and they weren't available in the UK at the time. So I tested it and I said back to Canon, blimey, it's as good as the Canon one. What does it cost? About £500? And he said, no, it's £111. Or at least it was 2 days ago when I looked at it on Amazon. So, you know, it's that sort of order. In other words, ring lights now, folks, are available, and they are as good as the Canon ones. Young and Yo make one for Nikon as well now, and they also make one with two lights, one either side, for Panasonic and Olympus. So they make them obviously different ones for different manufacturers, but they make them, and I don't know what those prices are. This is the Canon variant, but look, the difference in prices is massive. That's Amazon prices. Sorry, well, it wasn't Wex, it was Amazon. I beg your pardon. So Wex is probably more expensive still. 749 111. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I'm getting told to hurry up by Anne at the back. Other useful equipment that you might want to use. Look, now, you know, you don't need all this equipment. I started off today saying, you know, you can do things cheaply, but there are other things that might be useful. I've got cupboards full of stuff I've bought for macro over the years, but these are the things that I use most often for what I do. One is called a plamp. All right, and what a plamp is, and I have one here. A plamp is a device, something like this, you've never come across it. Basically, you attach this end to something rigid, like a tree or something, and attach this end, try and hold it in front of the picture, to a plant, so it will stop it blowing around in the wind. You can also use it to hold things like reflectors and so on. Or I could have, with that nettle picture earlier, I could have held the nettle in here and clamp this end to a stick in the ground or something. They're very good. You don't need to spend all the money that these cost. Here's the Wimberley site advertising them. There are lots of DIY options. I've seen them with bits of stiff wire, copper wire. This was squeaks, I'm sorry about that. Stiff wire with a clothes peg sellotape to either end. You know, big clothes peg. So you don't need to go to the length of the cost of these. And I think there are lots of other makes other than Wimberley available nowadays. I tend to use small reflectors as well, because small reflectors are really good. You know, the things that go ping and you can never you have to fold them up again. They're all job to wriggle around to get more back again. And they're great for bouncing light in underneath plants, fungi, etc. You know, there are many sorts. Triangular ones, if you're doing on your own, if you have somebody like Anne who's sitting behind me, you can get her to hold the reflector while I take the pictures. That's the great use of a photographic assistant. I'm looking behind me because I'm going to get thumped in a minute. And just for Diane, you have these things called focus racks or focus rails. Really useful because they allow you to make very small movements of the camera. Now, look, let me just try to explain this because they really are quite important. This is the Novoflex one. This one costs about £400-500. Look, don't go for them. They really are not worth getting. But what they do is they allow you to move the camera. I've got various ones here. I'm going to try and show you them. This is made by, I don't know if this is visible in your image. Yeah, this is made by Manfrotto. So this bit goes on your tripod. The bottom of it, there's a tripod mount, and the camera goes on here. All right, and this one's even got a millimeter scale down the side, so I can move my camera in small bits. Can you see? Through small. So in other words, if I'm trying to focus on something very, very small, this can be on my tripod. This can be the subject I'm trying to photograph where my hand is. And I can move the camera back and forth in very small amounts until it's absolutely sharp in focus. We talk about focus stacking in a minute, and I'm hoping I've got the time. Then this will allow you to do your focus stacking. Okay, that's made by Manfrotto. Very expensive because it's Manfrotto. This is the one not to buy. All right, this one is on eBay. Costs about 10 quid. And look, the movement is very coarse. Can you see? And really just is not good enough. It's all right. It's coarse because it's got a different sort of, it's got a rack system underneath it there. So it's not really that good. The one, there is one that is made by Neewer, same as the flash. There is one made by Neewer now, which is this one, which is £61 when I looked it up the other day, which is now got a rack movement in the middle. And I've never tried one. They're very, very new. They've only just appeared on the market. They look to be very good to me. The one that I like most of all is this one made by Leo Photo. It's their Leo-Photo is a German company. And you've got this bit, it goes onto the tripod here and your camera goes on there and you can wind it back and forth with this little wheel, which makes it very easy to move. All right. It costs, I can't remember what it costs. It's about 70 or 80 pounds, but you know, it really is worth it because it's got such fine control. And when you're doing stacking, and I promise you we will look at that, you can do in stages because you can wheel a thing around like that. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right. I also use these things called scissor jacks. I've got one here. Again, you know, it doesn't really matter. Here's my, oh, you can't see that, can you? Hang on, let's get up there. Nope. Okay, let's bear with me, folks, please. We have the technology here. I can. You still can't see it. Put it on the box. Oh, I'll hold it up. You've got this thing here, look, and you can you all see that? Anne, can you see it? Yeah. I can raise my cup up or down by turning this handle. You might say, what on earth is the point of that, Bob? Well, imagine in my cup of tea, which I'm about to spill in a second, so I better take it down. Imagine in my cup of tea, I've got is a plant, and it's a very small plant. So I'm trying to photograph this very small plant. It could be this. Get back to my presentation. I'll put my chair. No, put the picture down. I want to. Sorry, get you back. I beg your pardon. Sorry, folks. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. So we're trying to get to the point where I'm adjusting the plant up or down, and I'm adjusting the camera this way, and so I can get the very tiny point. Imagine I'm trying to photograph that sundew I showed you earlier on, and the sundew's in a plant pot. I can adjust things like this. These things, you know, is it worth having? Well, only if you really want them, but they're £14 on Amazon, so they're not massively expensive. So you know, they're really, really quite useful to have. Look, I've talked about focus stacking. I'm going to, Diane, I'm going to be about 5 minutes overdue. Is that all right? Diane,
yeah, 5 minutes.
I do apologize.
5 minutes.
Focus stacking, what is it? I say it's the latest HDR. It's the in fad to have, I think, in camera terms, and everybody's talking about it. Everybody's doing it. I've been doing it since the early 70s. We did it in film, and I came across some references many years ago of somebody who did something in 1850 something or other. If you go to the National Trust Museum of Photography, you'll find some examples of his work, and he was doing it with film and using masks on film. So this isn't masks in Photoshop. These are masks on negatives in enlargers to do the same sort of thing. But basically, it's a technique for increasing the depth of field. Okay, it's really useful in macro. All right, it's also useful in general photography. I've seen a couple of people commenting on using it for landscapes, but not very many. I know one landscape photographer who uses it extensively, but I think we're going to start seeing it coming up as the latest thing to use in landscapes as well, to get you big depth of field. If you choose a very small aperture, 22 or whatever, we get something called diffraction. And for those of you who don't know what I mean by diffraction, basically, as you shut your lens down to, you know, f16, f22, f32 in some cases, you start getting color aberrations. Diane is the expert on physics, she's already admitted to, so she know all about young slits and all the rest of it in her physics lessons at school, and the rainbow effect that was produced, and how Young discovered that, and it allowed him to discover electrons and photons and all this sort of wonderful stuff. But basically what's going on, if you shut it down too far, you start to get the thing called diffraction. If you hold your fingers up, don't do it now, but hold your fingers up and close the gap between your fingers. This is looking very rude, isn't it, doing this? But if I hold and I close the gap very small and I peer through that gap, a very, very small gap, you'll see that when you close the gap to being, I've got funny shaped fingers, you'll start seeing funny lines down the subject. Don't try it now, but try it. Somebody is trying it now, yes, but don't try it now. Try it some other time and you'll see what's going on. So small aperture doesn't work, all right? So you need a reasonably large aperture in order to get no diffraction. So you get shallow depth of field, you need to start to build it up in macro. There are a full set of notes I'm going to send this evening, all right, on how to do this. So don't try to remember what I'm going to do. It used to require specialist software. I use some specialist software from a company called Helicon to do this, but you don't need specialist software nowadays. Anything beyond CS4 and Gracious, most of us are way onto the sort of the pay-as-you-go Photoshop nowadays, or Infinity or whatever you use. Professional software is Helicon. There's some free software from a company called Combine ZP or Combine ZM. Please don't buy it. It only runs on XP computers. Windows XP. And if you've got Windows XP, perfect. But if you've got anything later, it doesn't work. So I've known people buy it or get it because it's free and then get into terrible tangles. And it works for a few days and it stops working and causes all sorts of frustration. Some cameras now allow you to focus stack in camera. So the Olympus and some Panasonics do that. Some cameras allow you to focus bracket. And I'm going to talk about the difference between those two in a minute because they are really, really important. Okay, Olympus is the leader in that case at the moment, allows you to focus stack in camera as well as focus bracket. Let's just look at what's going on. Okay, beware of the difference. So the difference is really important. And if you're being careful about what you want to do, and I'll show you an example, then you need to bracket, not stack in camera. Look, you need to use a focus rail in order to move things through fine degrees, because you need to move the camera, and I'll show you an example. And there are some, you can get some electronic focus rails. These things cost a lot of money. This is one made by a company called Cognisys. There are others around nowadays. So if you really want to get into these sort of 200 or 300 images in a stack, then this is the sort of product that you need to use. Leader is Cognisys and so on. Look, I'm going to give you an example. I can't do this in person because I'm not there, but this is a fish. So this fish is, you can see the size of the fish. This is this fish here, all right? He's about 9.5. Oh, no, he's not. The ruler's 9.5 centimeters. Anyway, you've got the idea. All right. Look, way focus stacking works is this. It's very simple. I take a picture where only the nose of the fish is in focus. I then take another photograph by moving the camera or focusing the lens so the eye is in focus. I now take another photograph so the gills are in focus. It's not a real fish. All right. And because it's got a pin in its head. I then take a picture on the middle is in focus and so on. You get the drift. All right. Some camera clubs, I'm daring enough to do this in person, but I've got 8 photographs now through the fish. So they go from there to there. In this picture, this photograph, come on, where's my dot's gone? There it is. The tail's in focus in this one, the nose in focus, and I've got all of the ones in between. Yeah. And then I bring them into Photoshop. Now, don't remember this because it's all in the notes. Okay. And so I bring them in and I pick or automate and so on. Photo merge. I'm pressing the wrong button on my keyboard. All right. And it then brings in all of the pictures. And when I've done this, I've called them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Very inventive name. Doesn't really matter what you call them. .jpg. It only works in JPEGs. Unless you do it in Lightroom, and somebody was asking about Bridge earlier. All right. But it only works in JPEG. It then brings all those together as layers. So again, I'm not getting too involved in the detail of this at the moment because it does it automatically. But those who know your Photoshop will know it's producing layers. You then click on this other button here, which says Auto Blend Layers to bring them all together. And you get this screen. And you click this little button here, it says OK. And you then go make a cup of tea. Because you've got a slow computer, it takes it a while to a little ball thing whizzes round, around, around. All right. And eventually it delivers up to you an image where everything is in focus. Can you see? From tip to tail, nose to tail. And what it's done, in effect, is it's built layer masks on each of the layers. So in this layer here, the nose is in focus. In this layer, the tail is in focus. So for all of those who know about masking in Photoshop, it's basically built all of these layer masks to allow only the part that's relevant to be in focus. All right. And in effect, what it's doing then is going from there to there. Now, if you want to do this yourself, and please do experiment because it's a great technique, all you really need to do is either use a focus rail, put your camera on it and move your camera through in steps through the subject. You want to make sure each step is less than the depth of field. All right. And you can tell it, you can understand by just shooting it and looking at the first ones, and you can soon work it out. There's no magical formula, just work it out. Have a look, take a picture, take another picture, take another picture. That's why I like this one, because it's one rotation of the wheel, or half a rotation if you want to, a quarter, whatever. And then see whether there's a point in between that's out of focus by looking at them on a computer. If they are, use smaller increments. Okay. And when you've got it right, do this. The trick, the first picture you take is of your hand. The last picture you take is of your hand. And so the sequence you've got are the ones that are on your card between your two hands. You with me? And then you follow that little scenario through Photoshop and it will put them into a stacked order for you. Look, you can do it with other things. This is another carnivorous plant, that Sarracenia that I showed you earlier on, picture plant. This is in flower. It should be in flower in about May. So these are the flowers. On the left, you've got the flowers in focus. On the right, you've got the pictures, P-I-T-C-H-E-R, in focus. And if I had half a dozen photographs between them, I can get everything in focus, including, and you'll see immense detail, like even the cobwebs. But look, this picture here, this is a sundew taken at the nursery, and I've arranged others behind it to get to that. And I wanted to show the sundew, but I didn't want this one to be absolute, but I didn't know, did I or didn't I? So when I took my stack of photographs, I had one where this particular thing was in focus, yeah? But I decided to omit that from the ones I put into Photoshop so that this bit wasn't in focus. My personal view, you might want it in focus, you might not. The current practice is to have everything in focus and just the background out of focus. But, you know, that's what I wanted to do. Here is something different. This is this Venus flytrap again. Venus flytraps have 3 hairs on each side. And when an insect trips those 3 hairs, it snaps shut. Okay, so I wanted you to see that down its length, but I wanted the petiole, the stem behind, to be out of focus. All right, so that was my stack, went from there to there. Okay, you can do other things with it. I took a group of photographers down to the New Forest and we were photographing fungi, and they wanted to show these fungi, which are, don't worry about what they are, they're a form of ink cap, and the big trees behind. They wanted the trees to, you know, be parallel to the fungi and show the tall trees, tall fungi. But the trees be out of focus and the fungi to be in focus. What we did is we produced 6 photographs across the width of the fungus, okay? But the trees were out of focus. Combine them together with a focus stack and you got that photograph. You with me? So the technique is very, very simple. So say, you know, once one-to-one start, if anybody's really interested, I'm quite happy to take you through it in detail, but you don't need to do anything complicated. So people tell you it's complicated, it isn't. Go and experiment this weekend. Sunshine out today, you can do it, you know? You can do it handheld as well, actually. We're getting cameras that take 20 pictures a second nowadays. So if you actually press your button to move, you know, a centimeter, as you press to take 20 pictures, then you're going to get 20 pictures in a centimeter, which will be your stack. Okay, remember to put your finger in front of the lens at the beginning and your finger in front of the lens at the end, and you'll get, you know, your markers. Otherwise you get muddled up as to what is what. The gentleman who asked about bridge, you can do focus stacking without bridge, but the great thing about bridge or Lightroom is it allows you to select the 6 pictures that are those that you want to work on and then to pop them straight into Photoshop. But you don't need bridge. So I think that was the question. I might pick it up if somebody wants to ask later on. Okay, so in summary, look, what have we looked at this evening? It's fantastic, it's fun, and it's not difficult. Okay, remember the 3 scenarios, if you like, and do remember extension tubes. You know, my favorite really. Dedicated macro lens if you can afford it and you want it. Macro lens with extension tubes are great. Ring flash, you know, they're getting affordable now. Okay, if you're lucky enough to own it, the Iowa lens or this lens here is a brilliant lens. By the way, you can, if you're doing a piece of work, you can hire lenses. By the way, on my website is a link to a brilliant hire company. And look at focus stacking. It isn't complicated. You know, these are the ones we looked at earlier on: 100 to 400, 12mm zoom, 500, 12mm extension tube, 60mm macro Canon ring light. You know, that dedicated one, Canon ring light. And those as well. Okay, I've hinted. I'm stopping now for those of you who are getting to feel I've gone too long, and I do apologize. I will send out electronically information to Rashid and to Diana. Diane, sorry, not Diana. And there's some additional information on my website. And the information will contain all of this sort of thing, complete copy of the presentation, plus lots of links and tips and so on. I'll send it in the form that you can attach to an email and you can then download, if that makes sense. Okay.
Okay. Thank
I
you.
hope that's been helpful.
Absolutely. You know, it's the first time I've heard the theory behind all this. I just get out there, get my lens and click away. for those Olympus users, the photo stacking, you don't have to do all the stuff on Photoshop because it does it in camera for you.
Absolutely.
Which is quite nice. You end up with a nice JPEG. Does work. There's a couple of things on here very quickly because I'm conscious of time. The lower lenses are manual only. So
Yes, they are. Yes, sorry, I should have said that. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so thanks for that.
And they only work on crop sensors at the moment, although, spoiler alert, they're about to bring them out for full frame cameras as well.
Okay, and Sue also says she's too scared to reverse the ring in case she gets dust on the lens. And I think you did mention that, didn't you?
Yeah, you just have to be careful, I'm afraid. I mean, you know, but who's the question from?
Sue.
Sue. So I'm not going to ask you what camera you've got and what lenses you've got, but as long as it's a good camera and a good lenses, you really can get up to 2 times, 3, 4 times life size without reversing it. So, you know, it's only if you're using cheap lenses, and you don't look like a person to use cheap lenses.
Okay. No, she's not. And Neewer make ring lights with assorted size attachments from about 25 to 30 pounds. Interesting enough, I've just bought one not long ago.
Who's that? Sorry.
Is it Neewer? How do you pronounce
Neewer,
it?
yeah,
Neewer?
they're not
Neewer?
genuine ring lights, the newer ones. They're not genuine ring lights.
Okay, I don't mean I bought the ring light. I mean I bought just the little.
Yeah, they buy LED ring lights. I mean, I would never. LED ring lights do not produce enough light. If you want ring lights, that £111 one comes with a sort of attachments for different lenses. Yes, as well.
Okay.
The one I showed you, the Youngin thingy one. If
Oh,
you buy it from Japan, and wait for it to come on that boat through the Suez Canal,
Okay. Well, if
it costs about £70.
If there's any Olympus users in our club, I know there's a few. If you want to borrow my ring flash, you're welcome to have a go with it. I haven't used it much actually. I've just made a note of it because I tend not to use it, but I'm going to get back into it. But yeah, anyone out there is welcome to borrow it if they've got a Panasonic or Olympus and they want to have a go. More than happy for you to do that. Thank you so much, Bob. What I'm going to do without any further ado is I'm going to hand you over to Sue.
Of expensive lenses.
Yeah, talk expensive lenses. I fell into macro photography about 3 years ago to overcome my fear of spiders. So I'm known as spider lady because most of my spiders tend to be spiders. But Bob, I just want to say thank you very much on behalf of everybody at the club for sharing all your techniques, your knowledge, and also your wonderful photos. I thoroughly enjoyed learning a little bit more about the science and the physics behind some of the photography, and also loved your presentation with all the illustrations. It's a nice way of learning, so thank you very much for that. It all makes sense. And also all the little accessories, explaining to us all the little accessories, what they do, what they don't do, what they can and can't do. It's all really helpful. I think mine and a lot of other members' wish list for Christmas and birthdays is getting longer and longer and more expensive every year. And I'm sure that hopefully after your presentation we'll see lots more photographers within the club because that's my passion. So thank you once again from all of us. It's a fantastic presentation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Sue. On behalf of Bishop Stortford Camera Club, can we give Bob a round of applause for our appreciation? Thanks so much, Bob. Physics was my worst subject at school. But do you know, I was really interested in that. It's absolutely brilliant. So thank you so much. You've enlightened me, I think. I didn't have a very nice physics teacher. I think that's what I put it down to.
I'm not going to comment.
Anyway, thanks ever so much. And thank you for the handouts that you're going to pass on to Sophia and myself as
Probably
well.
tomorrow morning before I email them. Apologies.
Absolutely brilliant. That would be really useful. Thank you. Giving us loads of food for thought. I want to get back out there and start taking photos again.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll leave you to your own devices. You can talk about me when I go there, you see.
No, thanks ever so much.
Thanks so much for inviting me. All right. Cheerio then. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks for doing that, Sue. And thanks, everybody. I hope you have a good night's sleep and look forward to seeing you next week for our multi-battle with all the other clubs. I'm excited. I don't know what images have been selected.
Nor do we yet.
You're not done it yet.
Doing it on Thursday.
Oh, so it's a surprise for all of us, Mark.
Yeah.
Phew, I thought I'd missed something. That's all right then. We'll leave it in your capable hands then. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Di. Thanks,
And
everyone.
see you next week.
Yeah,
Take
will
care.
do.
Good night, all.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. Good night.
Bye, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.